Hello, where curiosity gets cozy and questions drift like slow-moving clouds through the night sky. Tonight, we're wandering somewhere older than history, into the dim light of memory itself. You might want to settle in, maybe dim the lights, or adjust your blanket, because this one reaches far back beyond pyramids and scrolls, beyond kings and calendars, to a time when the world was mostly wild, and stories were all we had to remember who we were. Let me ask you something before we begin. When you were a child, did you ever hear a story that felt different from the others? One that didn't just sound like make-believe, but something deeper, like your imagination was brushing against a truth too old to name. Maybe it was a tale about a great flood, or shining visitors from the sky, or a golden age when people spoke to the stars. Wherever you are right now, think about that story for a moment. What if it wasn't just a myth? What if it was a memory? If you find these quiet investigations comforting, these soft spirals into wonder, I'd be so grateful if you like this video or subscribe to this sleepy corner of science. It helps us find other night thinkers, people who find calm in curiosity. Now, take a breath. Let's begin this journey together, somewhere between archaeology and dream, where myth might be history, seen through the haze of forgetting. Because tonight we're asking a question that has followed humanity for as long as we've been able to ask anything at all. What if ancient myths are not fiction, but the memories of a civilization that came before everything we know? Human beings have always told stories long before writing, before chiseling marks into stone or pressing ink into papyrus. We had our voices around campfires, in caves, under skies filled with unfamiliar constellations. We spoke to one another about where we came from and what the world once was. Those first storytellers were not authors, they were rememberers. When they told of gods descending from the clouds, or of cities swallowed by the sea, they weren't necessarily inventing, they were repeating. The details may have changed with every telling, but something in the structure of those stories remained persistent, stubborn, impossible to erase. That's the strange thing about myth. It carries a pulse. Beneath all the exaggerations and metaphors, there's often a rhythm that feels grounded, like a fossil pressed into narrative form. Across continents that never met, cultures that never spoke to one another, we find the same bones hidden in different bodies of story. Civilizations separated by oceans somehow remembered the same kind of world, ending in the same kind of flood. They remembered beings who came from the heavens and taught them to plant, to measure, to build. They remembered golden ages followed by cataclysms, towers reaching too high, fire falling from the sky, oceans swallowing cities whole. It's tempting to say these are coincidences, archetypes, expressions of the same human imagination, and maybe they are, but sometimes the consistency feels a little too specific. When myths from Sumer, Mesoamerica, and Southeast Asia all describe the world covered in water after a sudden catastrophe, we might ask ourselves if our ancestors were simply creative, or if they were remembering something real, something that happened to them. Archaeologists often speak of a kind of cultural amnesia that blankets prehistory. Writing appeared only about 5,000 years ago, agriculture maybe 12. Before that, tens of thousands of years stretched behind us, mostly silent. But silence is not the same as nothing. The people who lived then were not blank pages waiting for civilization to begin. They built, they carved, they sang. Some of their works survive, worn and half-buried. Carvings at Göbekli, older than the pyramids, aligned to the stars with precision that suggests deliberate design. Others vanished entirely, perhaps beneath floods, ice, or time itself. What if somewhere within that forgotten span of time, there was a civilization advanced enough to seed myths that would echo through millennia? Not advanced in the way we think of technology, not skyscrapers and satellites, but advanced in a way that combined knowledge, astronomy, architecture, and storytelling so seamlessly that even after it was lost, fragments of its memory survived as myth. It's an unsettling thought, 'cause it means we might not be the first to look at the stars and wonder if we once knew them better. It means the stories of Atlantis, of Lemuria, of gods who walked among mortals, might not be inventions at all, but the last reflections of something our species experienced and could not completely forget. When Plato wrote about Atlantis, he wasn't spinning a fable. He claimed he was repeating an older Egyptian story told to centuries before. The Egyptians, in turn, said they were simply passing along what their own ancestors had survived. A great flood, the fall of an advanced people, a world reset. Myths like these aren't rare, they're everywhere, from the sinking land of Kumari Kandam in Tamil to the stories of flood survivors among the Hopi and the Maui. We find humanity remembering something overwhelming, something that changed everything. Could so many cultures have independently imagined the same event? Possibly. Shared fears and human imagination can travel far, but it's also possible that our ancestors lived through global events, melting ice sheets, sea level rises, comet impacts, and carried those memories in the only way they could, by telling stories. Myth may be our oldest data storage. It can preserve information, not in numbers or text, but in symbol, metaphor, and rhythm. A flood story might not just be a moral lesson, it could be a recollection of the end of the last ice age, when glacial melt caused oceans to rise hundreds of feet, drowning coastal plains that may once have been home to thriving communities. The detail of people surviving on boats, animals gathered in pairs, rain falling for days. These could be memories shorthand for a catastrophe so massive that language could only approximate it. And then there are the sky gods. Almost every culture tells of beings who descended from above, sometimes bringing tools or wisdom, sometimes creating humanity itself. Sumer had the Anunnaki. The Dogon people of Mali told of the Nomo, amphibious teachers from the star Sirius. The Maya spoke of gods descending from the sky in bright craft. Aboriginal Australians told of star ancestors who came to Earth to shape the land. We interpret these as religious imagery, symbolic representations of creation. But if myths are memories, could they be describing contact, not necessarily with extraterrestrials, but with survivors of an earlier human world? People so advanced, relative to those who remained, that they seemed divine. After all, if civilization had risen and fallen once before, its survivors might have appeared to later hunter-gatherers as gods. Imagine a handful of people carrying the last fragments of advanced knowledge, navigation, astronomy, architecture, into a world that had forgotten. Imagine them teaching farming, stone shaping, or celestial mapping to others who had no concept of such things. Generations later, their deeds would become divine. The evidence, as always, is fragmentary. We find ancient maps that seem to depict coastlines as they would have looked before the end of the Ice Age. We find megaliths oriented with astronomical precision, built by cultures we thought were still simple. We find myths that describe stars invisible to the naked eye, or celestial events that can be dated to epochs far earlier than the civilizations recording them. None of this proves a forgotten civilization existed, but taken together, it begins to look less like fantasy and more like a pattern, one blurred by time, but still faintly visible. The idea of an earlier civilization isn't new. From Plato to Graham Hancock, from early explorers to modern archaeologists, people have searched for evidence of it. Some find clues in submerged ruins off the coasts of India and Japan, where structures lie beneath the waves, in places that were dry land 12,000 years ago. Others point to the precision of megalithic architecture, the sudden appearance of agriculture and mathematics, or the shared astronomical motifs found in cultures continents apart. Each piece on its own is inconclusive, but myths have a way of weaving these fragments together into a larger possibility. Perhaps the most intriguing part is how memory itself behaves. Human memory is not perfect. It degrades, simplifies, and transforms over generations. When oral traditions pass through hundreds of storytellers, the literal truth dissolves. but the structure of the story remains. A flood becomes a god's punishment. A lost island becomes a moral tale. But under the symbolism, a core of experience persists, like a bone within a fossil. Modern neuroscience tells us that emotional events imprint more deeply than ordinary ones. Catastrophes, losses, great changes, they carve grooves in collective memory. So if our ancestors truly lived through the collapse of a great civilization, it makes sense that the memory of that trauma would survive, reshaped as myth, carried across continents as a warning and a remembrance. And yet there's another reason myths endure. They explain what evidence cannot. When people thousands of years ago found cyclopean ruins or vast stones they couldn't have lifted themselves, they filled the gaps in understanding with stories. The people who built these, they said, must have been giants or gods or something greater than us. Maybe they were, or maybe those myths were our ancestors' way of remembering a people who once were greater, not supernatural, but simply lost. Some researchers suggest that the human brain might even be wired to preserve these kinds of ancestral memories at a cultural level. We see patterns, we recognize recurring shapes in stories, and we transmit them not just through words, but through rituals, symbols, and art. It's possible that myths are an emergent form of long-term memory, a kind of intergenerational hard drive encoded in storytelling. If that's true, then the stories we call myths might not just be entertainment or morality tales. They could be the memory of humanity itself, compressed, simplified, and reinterpreted to survive forgetting. So when we read about gods, teaching writing, or cities destroyed by divine wrath, or people scattered by great disasters, maybe we're hearing more than metaphor. Maybe those are glimpses of history before history. Perhaps myth is how civilization talks in its sleep, half dreaming, half remembering what came before. There's something humbling about that possibility. It means the distance between myth and memory isn't as vast as we imagine. It means that our species, even in its earliest days, was capable of remembering across thousands of years of turning survival into story and story into identity. And it also means that the first civilization, if it existed, never truly vanished. Its monuments may have fallen, its knowledge scattered, but its essence survived in words. Every time we tell a story about creation, about floods, about light and darkness, we may be echoing their last attempt to explain themselves. The more you think about it, the more plausible it becomes that myths weren't born from imagination alone, but from the effort to preserve truth in the only format that could endure when everything else was lost. Because when you lose your cities, your tools, your language, what's left? Stories spoken, sung, retold, until they become timeless. Maybe that's why these stories still move us. Somewhere, deep inside, we recognize them. We feel their familiarity, not because we've heard them before in books, but because they've been whispered down through countless generations all the way to us. They belong to the same mind that looked up at the stars and saw home. And as we continue, we'll follow those echoes further through floods that never died, stones that shouldn't exist, and symbols that might be messages from the past. We won't rush, we'll wander carefully, listening for what the old stories might still be trying to tell us. If myth is memory, then somewhere in the long dusk before written history, there must have been a moment when remembering became a necessity. A moment when survival depended not just on knowing where to find food or shelter, but on holding on to something deeper, the knowledge of what came before. Imagine a world with no cities, no metal, no permanent roads. The horizon is your calendar, the stars your clock, the seasons your teachers. Firelight flickers on the faces of small groups huddled together, and the stories begin. The ones that have to be told, so that everything learned is not lost. This was not yet civilization as we think of it. No kings, no temples, no writing etched in clay, but there was intelligence and language, and an awareness that knowledge could die, if not carried carefully. That awareness is what makes this period so haunting. It's the invisible foundation on which everything later was built. The people of this time, our ancestors, didn't have history books, but they had memory. And in those memories burned the first sparks of civilization. Archaeologists find traces of this deep memory scattered like embers across the world. Stone tools, shaped with delicate precision, burial sites arranged with a sense of ritual, cave paintings that seem to shimmer with motion and meaning. Each of these is evidence of minds not just surviving, but thinking abstractly, creatively, curiously. The caves of Lascaux in France, painted some 17,000 years ago, are not the work of a species barely awake. They are the work of artists. The animals galloping across those walls are not just decoration. They are communication, symbols charged with purpose. When you look at those images closely, you can sense a bridge forming between instinct and intellect. The people who made them were seeing patterns, cycles, relationships. They understood seasons and migration, the turning of the sky. They knew when herds moved, when rivers rose, when the moon would fade and return. And perhaps most importantly, they remembered. To remember across generations is a form of technology, not a tool you can hold, but a structure of thought that allows knowledge to persist. Somewhere in this period, humans discovered that words could outlive them. They realized that spoken memory could be passed forward like a torch, and once that happened, myth became the engine of survival. Now imagine that this skill, this ability to record experience through story, wasn't just used for hunting or farming, but for something larger, for preserving the memory of an entire way of life. If a civilization existed before the one we know, its fool would have demanded storytellers. If cities drowned or mountains burned, someone would have had to explain it to the next generation. They wouldn't have written it down. They would have told it in the language of images and emotion, gods and floods, light and darkness, rebirth and loss. These would become the myths we still tell. Somewhere around 12,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. The Earth began to thaw. The last ice age ended. Glaciers retreated, and sea levels rose with astonishing speed. Climate scientists call this period the Younger Dest Boundary, a time of violent shifts, sudden floods, and catastrophic weather changes. To the people alive, then it must have felt like the world itself was breaking apart. Forests appeared, where there had been tundra, animals migrated, whole coastlines vanished beneath the waves. It's no surprise that so many ancient myths describe floods and destruction. They may not be allegories at all. They may be eyewitness accounts told by survivors. What we call mythology might simply be humanity processing a global trauma, the loss of everything familiar. In this time of upheaval, small groups of people may have clung to pockets of stability. Archaeological sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey suggest that organized societies existed long before we thought possible. Massive stone pillars carved with intricate symbols and animals stand arranged in circles, some weighing tons, erected by people who, according to the textbooks, should still have been nomadic. The site is more than 11,000 years old, older than Stonehenge, older than the first cities of Mesopotamia. It's as if someone, somewhere, remembered how to build. The question is, where did that knowledge come from? Why, after tens of thousands of years of simple tools and shelters, did people suddenly begin constructing vast symbolic monuments aligned with the stars? It's a question that continues to unsettle archaeologists. One possibility is that the people who built these structures weren't inventing from scratch. They were rebuilding, trying to restore fragments of something older, something nearly lost. In the myths that surround early civilizations, we hear the same echo: gods teaching architecture, agriculture, astronomy, deities descending to instruct humanity in the arts of civilization. But if you strip away the divine imagery, what remains? Teachers, survivors, people who knew things others didn't. If a civilization had fallen and a few of its members endured, this is exactly how their knowledge would re-enter the world. Not as a system, but as stories passed through generations until they became divine legends. Imagine those survivors walking through a landscape still scarred by disaster, rivers swollen with meltwater, forests blackened by fire, the air heavy with ash. To the scattered tribes they met, these figures must have seemed almost supernatural, bringers of lost arts, keepers of forbidden knowledge, and perhaps those tribes remembered them long after they were gone, shaping their memory into myths of gods who taught them how to live. Fire itself might have been the first symbol of this memory. It's one of the oldest human companions, but also one of the most powerful metaphors. It can destroy, but it also preserves. It turns clay into pottery, hardens metal, protects against darkness. For early humans, fire was a living boundary between safety and the unknown. It was the first technology that changed not just how we survived, but how we imagined. Around the fire, people shared knowledge, sang songs, and retold the past. The flame became a teacher, a companion, and perhaps a reminder of something even older. When anthropologists study early myths about fire, they find patterns that suggest it was more than just a discovery. Many stories describe fire being given to humanity, stolen from the gods, granted by a divine being, or brought down from the sky. In Greek myth, Prometheus steals fire from Olympus. In Polynesian stories, the hero Maui tricks the goddess of fire to bring it to the world. Among the Navajo, the holy people send animals to retrieve fire for humans. In all of these tales, fire isn't simply found, it's bestowed. That detail might preserve a faint memory of contact, of knowledge shared between different groups, or of something much older being rediscovered. If you think of fire as symbolic of civilization itself, warmth, light, knowledge, then the myth of its gift might be an echo of the moment when lost knowledge was returned. The fire before history may not refer to literal flames, but to the light of understanding rekindled after a long darkness. We know that humans are not the first species to use tools, but we are the first to use them to build memory. Stone, wood, pigment, and fire all became extensions of thought. By the time early humans began domesticating plants and animals, they were already shaping the world intentionally. They built shrines, painted celestial symbols, buried their dead with care. These acts suggest a consciousness of time, not just living in the moment, but remembering the past and anticipating the future. In that sense, the first civilization may not have been a single city or culture at all, but a network of human groups, connected by shared knowledge and mutual memory. A civilization of thought rather than architecture, stretching across continents in the minds of those who carried fire and story wherever they went. Archaeological evidence hints at this possibility. Stone tools in Africa and the Middle East show similar design principles, separated by thousands of miles. Cave art across Europe and Asia uses near-identical symbols, dots, spirals, handprints, as if people from different continents were speaking variations of the same visual language. This doesn't prove contact, but it does suggest a shared origin, a deep inheritance of symbols that may have survived from an earlier unified culture. It's strange to think that we can see echoes of this shared language even today. The spiral, for instance, appears everywhere in Celtic carvings, Mayan temples, Aboriginal rock art, and Hindu yantras. It represents motion, energy, cycles, concepts that predate philosophy itself. How could the same motif appear independently across the world? Some say it's coincidence, a natural form found in shells and galaxies. But maybe it's something more. Maybe it's one of the last traces of an older system of meaning, a visual memory passed down so long that we no longer know where it came from. When you look at the evidence in this way, history starts to look less like a straight line and more like a series of recoveries. Knowledge rises, falls, and is rediscovered, like fire being reignited again and again from dying embers. The myth of a first civilization might not point to a single lost city under the sea, but to the persistent pattern of human memory, the way we forget and remember in cycles, the way progress can vanish and then reappear as legend. Some researchers believe that this pattern might explain why civilizations seem to bloom so suddenly. Agriculture, writing, architecture, astronomy, all appeared in a relatively short span after the Ice Age. That acceleration might not have been innovation, but recollection, humanity reawakening to what it had already known, perhaps imperfectly, but with flashes of recognition strong enough to rebuild. In many ways, that's what myths do. They rebuild. They fill the gaps left by disaster and forgetting. They let us reconstruct the shape of lost knowledge through stories that still carry its months. Outline. If we listen carefully to ancient tales, we can hear hints of these reconstructions. The Sumerians spoke of kings ruling before the flood for thousands of years. The Egyptians remembered the Zepte, the first time when gods walked the earth and taught humans how to live. The Mer recorded ages of creation and destruction, each separated by cataclysm. The Greeks told of the ages of man, golden, silver, bronze, and iron, each one a step further from a lost perfection. These myths might not describe literal epochs, but they could reflect cycles of civilization, memory, and loss repeating through time. To us, living in a world of digital archives and endless records, the idea of forgetting an entire civilization feels impossible. But in a world without writing, where knowledge lived only in human minds, it wouldn't take much. A few generations of chaos, famine, flood, war, and the continuity would break. What survived would be fragments coded in story. The names might change, the gods might take on new forms, but the core memory would remain. It's also possible that some of those fragments survived in the form of practical knowledge. Star maps, agricultural calendars, architectural ratios passed down without explanation. We see examples of this in ancient sites, aligned precisely with solstices and equinoxes. We find patterns in myths that encode astronomical data like precession cycles or eclipses. These are not coincidences. They suggest deliberate preservation of information, too complex to be accidental. Someone knew how to read the sky long before telescopes or modern instruments, and they taught others through stories. Think of it like this. If you wanted to preserve scientific knowledge for 10,000 years, you couldn't rely on language. Words change, scripts are forgotten, but stories endure. If you wanted people in the far future to remember when to plant crops or how to measure the stars, you'd hide that information in myth, in tales of gods and animals, in rituals tied to the seasons, in songs that repeat across centuries. That's exactly what our ancestors did. Myth was not primitive science. It was resilient science, disguised in narrative to survive the erosion of time. Perhaps that's what the fire before history really was. Not the literal flame, but the spark of preservation, the invention of storytelling as technology. Before writing, before numbers, before maps, humans invented continuity, and that may be the most important invention of all. It's humbling to think that every word we speak, every story we tell, might carry a residue of that original fire, the flame that kept the past alive long enough for it to become myth. We are still passing it along now, in ways our ancestors could never have imagined, through books, through screens, through voices carried quietly into the night. If those ancient myths are indeed memories, then what they remember is not just cities or catastrophes, but the very act of remembering itself. They remind us that civilization begins not with walls or tools, but with the decision to keep the fire going, to tell the story again, even when the world has gone dark. And as we move forward in this journey, that's where we'll stay, close to the embers, watching as they glow brighter, revealing the first signs of the world that might have been, and the memory that refused to die. Water remembers. It doesn't keep records in the way stone does. It doesn't hold the shape of a carving, or preserve the weight of a wall, but it moves. And in its movement, it carries traces of what came before. When the world warmed, after the Ice Age, water began to rise. Ice melted, rivers swelled, oceans crept inland, and everything humans had built near those ancient shores was swallowed. It's possible that what we now call the Great Flood was not a single event, but a series of them, overlapping and relentless, erasing coastlines that had been home for generations. Every continent has its version of the flood story. It isn't an isolated myth the way some creation stories are. It's a global memory told in countless accents. The Epic of Gilgamesh, carved into clay tablets thousands of years ago, describes a deluge so vast that even the gods trembled. The story of Noah in the Hebrew tradition echoes it closely. A chosen man warned of the coming flood, a vessel built, animals saved, waters rising, and the world reborn. In Hindu texts, Vishnu warns Manu of a cosmic flood, instructing him to build a boat and carry the seeds of life. The ancient Greeks spoke of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived when Zeus drowned the world for its Pyrrha corruption. The Chinese tell of Gun and Yu, who battled rising waters for decades. The indigenous peoples of the Americas have their own flood stories, from the Hopi and the Inca to tribes of the Pacific Northwest. Even in Australia, where the land is ancient and dry, Aboriginal stories describe rising seas swallowing coastal plains thousands of years ago. It's easy to think these stories are moral parables, lessons about humility and renewal. But when they appear everywhere, repeating the same structure, the same pattern, it's difficult not to wonder if they all began from the same experience, a shared trauma remembered differently, but rooted in something real. During the last ice age, much of the Earth's water was locked in glaciers. When the planet warmed, that water had to go somewhere. Sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, slowly at first, then in catastrophic pulses as ice sheets collapsed. Scientists have found evidence of sudden floods, known as meltwater pulses, events where massive volumes of water poured into the oceans in a matter of years, not centuries. One of these around 12,000 years ago might have raised sea levels by several meters in a single, human lifetime. For people living on the coasts, that would have been the end of the world. Imagine standing on a shoreline that your ancestors had lived on for generations and watching the horizon creep closer every season. The sea would claim fields, forests, entire villages. At first, it might seem gradual, manageable. But then, one spring, the ice far to the north collapses, rivers burst from their beds, and within weeks, the ocean surges inland. The sky's full of rain, the ground trembles, the air tastes of salt. You climb the hills, leaving behind everything you knew, and when you look back, your world is gone. Those who survived would tell that story. They would describe water rising beyond measure, of gods angry or grieving, of a few spared to begin again. They would build boats, literal or symbolic, to preserve what little remained, and as generations passed, those memories would solidify into myth. The flood that ended one world and began another. Modern geology supports some of these ancient memories. In the Black Sea region, researchers have found evidence that a massive flood occurred around 7,600 years ago, when rising Mediterranean waters broke through the Bosphorus and poured into a freshwater lake, transforming it into the sea we know today. The event would have been apocalyptic for those living nearby, a sudden, unstoppable wall of water swallowing farmland and settlements. Similar evidence appears in other places, submerged structures off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Bahamas, ancient riverbeds now hundreds of meters underwater, traces of habitation on what are now ocean floors. If we think of myths as a kind of long-term cultural memory, then these flood stories might be the record of a global event remembered in fragments, each culture describing its local piece of a shared disaster, retold through symbols and metaphors that carried meaning across generations. In that sense, the flood wasn't just a story about punishment or cleansing, it was about loss. It was about what happens when the world changes faster than people can adapt. And perhaps buried in the heart of these stories was a warning. Remember what happened when we forgot the balance between ourselves and the earth. The flood myths are also deeply connected to another theme that appears again and again, the idea of a golden age that ended. In nearly every culture, there's a memory of a time when life was easy. when humans lived in harmony with nature, when knowledge was abundant, and then something went wrong. The flood in this reading is not just water, it's the boundary between that world and ours, the point where the memory of the first civilization sank beneath the waves. When Plato described Atlantis, he said it was an island nation beyond the Pillars of Hercules, rich in knowledge and power, that fell out of favor with the gods, and was destroyed by floods and earthquakes, in a single day and night of misfortune. He wasn't the first to tell this story. He said he was repeating an Egyptian account, already ancient in his time. The Egyptians themselves spoke of previous worlds destroyed and reborn. The pattern repeats in Sumerian tablets, in Aztec codices, in Polynesian chants. The world ends, the waters rise, a few survive, and humanity begins again. It's possible that these aren't separate myths, but multiple memories of the same turning point in human history, the moment the last remnants of the first civilization disappeared. When the seas rose, they didn't just drown land, they erased maps, they erased evidence, they left behind questions. Under the waves off the coast of India lies the site known as Dwarka. Divers have found what appear to be man-made structures, walls, steps, and roads now submerged in the Arabian Sea. The dating is debated, but some evidence suggests human occupation there more than 9,000 years ago, long before the rise of the Indus Valley civilization. Off the coast of Japan, near Yonauni, a series of massive underwater terraces and steps have sparked similar debates. Are they natural formations, or the ruins of an ancient settlement? Scientists disagree, but the mystery remains. If these are human-built, they would belong to a time when those lands were dry before the sea rose to cover them. Even in places far from the ocean, we find traces of catastrophic floods. In North America, the scablands of Washington state were carved by enormous outbursts of glacial water near the end of the Ice Age. In the Middle East, sediment layers show sudden flooding in ancient river valleys. The evidence doesn't point to a single global deluge, but to a period when the world was repeatedly reshaped by water. To the people who lived through it, the difference wouldn't have mattered. Whether it was one flood or many, it felt like the end of everything. When we look at the flood stories through this lens, they stop being moral allegories and start becoming historical documents. Not precise, but emotionally accurate. Myths don't measure depth or date. They measure impact. They preserve how it felt, the confusion, the terror, the sense of something vast and uncontrollable, sweeping away the familiar. They also preserve the hope that followed, the idea that some part of humanity, some spark, endured, and perhaps that's why the flood story never died. It's more than memory, it's a metaphor for all human loss. Every generation faces its own flood, wars, plagues, disasters, and every time we tell the story again, the world was destroyed, and we began anew. It's the ultimate pattern of survival. But the question lingers, if there really was a first civilization, something advanced enough to seed myths across continents, where was it? And what did it look like before the waters came? Some researchers point toward the now submerged continental shelves, the lands that once connected Britain to Europe, India to Southeast Asia, and Siberia to Alaska. These regions, now underwater, would have been fertile plains, rich in resources, and ideal for settlement. When the seas rose, they disappeared, taking whatever cultures lived there with them. If a civilization had developed in one of these coastal areas, its ruins would now lie beneath hundreds of feet of water, beyond the reach of easy exploration. It's worth noting that many ancient myths place their lost lands beyond the known coasts, islands swallowed by the sea, lands of the West, cities beneath the waves. These might not have been inventions, but recollections of real places that sank as sea levels rose. To those who escaped inland, the ocean itself would become the grave of memory, the place where their ancestors' world was buried. The people who fled might have carried fragments of their knowledge with them. Farming techniques, astronomical observations, oral traditions. These fragments could have been the seeds from which later civilizations grew. When the floodwaters receded and new lands emerged, humans would begin again, guided by the faint memory of what had been lost. That idea, that civilization didn't appear out of nowhere, but was reborn from survivors, changes how we see ourselves. It suggests continuity rather than invention, resilience rather than miracle. Humanity, in this view, is not a story of endless progress, but of remembering and rebuilding after forgetting. Even in modern culture we carry this theme. We speak of clean slates, of starting fresh, of washing away the old. The language of renewal is soaked in the imagery of water. It's as if the memory of the flood still shapes how we think about change. What makes these myths so enduring is their universality. You don't need to know about glaciers or sea levels to understand the fear of rising water. You don't need science to feel what it means to lose your home and rebuild. The flood is a story every human can understand, because it's one we've all lived in some form. When scientists reconstruct ancient coastlines, they find evidence of human presence near what were once fertile shores, stone tools, hearths, traces of fishing settlements. These findings don't prove a great lost civilization, but they do prove something else. People were there living complex lives before the waters rose, and those people had to move. They had to remember, if they carried their memories inland, if they told their children about the land that sank beneath the sea, those stories would have spread as they migrated, changing shape with each retelling. Over time, the names of places would be forgotten, replaced with symbols, an ark, a mountain, a god. The memory would remain, but encoded in language that could survive the centuries. There's a strange symmetry in how modern science and ancient myth sometimes meet halfway. For example, genetic studies show that all non-African human populations share ancestry from a relatively small group of people who lived about 70,000 years ago, a bottleneck event that may have been caused by a natural disaster. In mythic terms, that's a kind of flood, too. Humanity nearly wiped out, then reborn from a few survivors. It's not proof that Noah's Ark or Atlantis existed, but it shows that deep survival events can leave marks not just on DNA, but on memory. We may not remember the details, but we remember the shape, the sense of loss, of renewal, of beginning again. That's what myth preserves best. When you think about it that way, the flood becomes something more than a story about water. It becomes a mirror of the human experience. Every civilization eventually faces its own flood, literal or symbolic. The rise of the sea, the fall of empires, the sweep of change that erases what once seemed eternal. And yet, every time someone survives, someone remembers, someone rebuilds. That's the deeper message hidden in the myth. The flood that wouldn't die isn't just the one that drowned the past. It's the one that keeps returning, generation after generation, to remind us that survival is memory in motion. That the act of telling these stories is itself a kind of ark, a vessel carrying the fragments of the old world into the new. And so, as the ancient waters recede in our imagination, we begin to see what might have come before them. A world of builders and watchers, of people who mapped the stars and measured the earth long before we rediscovered how. Their memory lingers in stone, in symbol, and in story. We'll follow those traces next to the places where sky and earth seem to meet. The domain of the old gods who, according to legend, came down from above to teach what the flood could not erase. After the waters retreated and the land settled into its new shapes, the world must have looked both familiar and strange. Forests crept over what had once been tundra, rivers found new paths, the outlines of continents changed. To the people who survived, it was as if they had been born into a second creation, a quieter one. They would have looked up at the same stars their ancestors once used to navigate the old world. But now those constellations hung over different horizons. The world had shifted, but the sky hadn't. That's the moment when humanity began looking upward, not just for direction, but for origin. In the oldest myths, the ones that stretch back beyond recorded language, the gods nearly always come from above. They descend on beams of light, chariots of fire, thunder, or clouds. They are teachers and builders, often bringing with them the tools of civilization, agriculture, writing, astronomy, the use of stone. To the people on the ground, these were miracles. To the people telling the stories later, they were metaphors. But what if at their root, they were memories? It's easy to see why early humans would associate the heavens with wisdom. The sky was the one constant through all the chaos of the earth. The stars didn't flood, they didn't burn, they didn't vanish. They returned every night in the same quiet order. Tracking them gave rhythm to life, turning the sky into the first calendar. To watch the heavens was to see patterns, days, seasons, years, and to predict the world's moods. Somewhere along the way, those who mastered this skill became something more than ordinary. They became keepers of time, watchers of the cosmos. To those around them, they would have seemed godlike, but the stories are strangely specific. In Sumer, the first recorded civilization, the gods known as the Anunnaki were said to have come from the heavens and taught humanity the arts of living, cultivation, measurement, metallurgy. In Mesoamerica, the god Quetzalcoatl arrived from the sky and gave people knowledge of corn, numbers, and writing. In Egypt, Thirch was credited with inventing mathematics and hieroglyphs, gifts from the divine. In Polynesian traditions, the god Tangaroa came down to shape islands and teach navigation by stars. All of these cultures were separated by oceans and time, yet their stories rhyme in ways that feel too coordinated to be coincidence. Some scholars interpret this as the natural human tendency to project knowledge onto the divine, but others suggest something different, that these stories might reflect a shared memory of real teachers, people who appeared suddenly with skills and understanding far beyond the local norm. If an earlier civilization had fallen, and a handful of its survivors carried knowledge into the new world, they might easily have been mistaken for gods. Imagine arriving in a small community of hunter-gatherers with knowledge of engineering, agriculture, or astronomy. To them, you would seem as if you came from the stars. It's not just the stories of arrival that link these myths, it's what the supposed gods taught. Across continents, they shared three main gifts: how to grow food, how to measure the earth, and how to read the sky. These are the cornerstones of civilization, and they appeared with remarkable suddenness after the last ice age. Archaeology shows that within a few thousand years, humans across the planet independently developed agriculture, cities, and calendars independently, or so we assume. But what if it wasn't entirely independent? What if the rapid emergence of these skills was more like a reintroduction, knowledge rediscovered or remembered rather than invented anew? The mythic sky gods might not have been divine at all, but human inheritors of a lost culture, spreading fragments of the old world's wisdom to those rebuilding in the new. That would explain why the earliest monuments we know, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Egypt, the temples of Mesoamerica, all seem to point upward. They aren't just tombs or shrines, they're attempts to reach back to the heavens where knowledge once descended. They're architectural memories, built to mirror the connection between sky and earth. The precision of their construction, often aligned perfectly with stars and solstices, suggests that those who built them were not guessing. They were following blueprints older than their own cultures. It's striking how many of these ancient structures serve as both temples and observatories. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to within fractions of a degree with the cardinal rections. The layout of the pyramids mirrors the stars of Orion's belt. At Teotihuacan, in Mexico, the Avenue of the Dead runs along a precise astronomical axis, and the entire city may have been designed as a cosmic map. At Stonehenge, massive stones mark the sunrise at the summer solstice and the moon's cycles. The ancient Nabta, plier stones in the Sahara, older still, track the rising of specific stars. These alignments are not accidents. They reveal a consistent pattern of sky watching and celestial mapping across cultures that, supposedly, had no contact. The question is not whether they were astronomers, but where they learned such careful geometry and timing. You don't build a structure like the Great Pyramid without centuries of accumulated knowledge. Yet, according to conventional timelines, the societies that built them seem to leap from simple stonework to near-perfect precision almost overnight. That leap is easier to understand if you imagine it as remembering rather than inventing. If the survivors of a flood or catastrophe carried fragments of geometry, navigation, or staro, they might have rebuilt what they could, teaching others along the way. Over time, those teachers would become legends, sky gods, builders, map makers. The knowledge they shared would become ritual, then religion, and eventually myth. The sky to ancient peoples wasn't just a place of light, it was order, it was permanence. Watching it allowed them to predict floods, plant crops, and navigate across featureless oceans. The people who could do that seemed capable of controlling the world itself. Many ancient cultures believe their gods lived among the stars and descended to earth only to deliver wisdom. That belief could easily be a memory of teachers who once returned from long journeys, sailors or explorers bringing news from lands across the sea. Perhaps even remnants of that first civilization, rediscovering the scattered human family. Even more intriguing is how these myths preserve astronomical details that match real phenomena. The ancient Egyptians placed enormous importance on the star Sirius, whose rising marked the annual flooding of the Nile. The Dune people of West Africa also revere Sirius, and their oral tradition contains remarkably accurate information about its companion star, invisible to the naked eye, long before telescopes existed in the Americas. The Ma tracked Venus with extraordinary precision, charting its cycles over centuries. How did so many ancient people achieve such accuracy? Observations alone can explain some of it, but not all. It takes generations of consistent recordkeeping to refine those measurements, and that requires not just observation, but a system one that may have been inherited. The same could be said of ancient maps. The Piraeus map, drawn in the 16th century, but based on older sources, shows the coastlines of South America and Antarctica with surprising accuracy, including features that would have been covered by ice during recorded history. Some researchers believe the original data for such maps came from far older charts, perhaps created by a civilization with seafaring capability long before the known age of exploration. The idea of prehistoric navigation sounds implausible until you look at the evidence of ancient voyages. The Polynesians crossed vast distances of the Pacific, using only the stars, waves, and birds to guide them. Egyptians and Sumerians sailed across the Red Sea and Persian Gulf thousands of years before. Recorded trade routes, artifacts, and genetic traces hint at contact between distant cultures long before historians thought possible. If the first civilization was indeed global, or at least widespread, its people may have been the original mapmakers, their roots preserved not in writing but in myth. Many flood legends include the motif of people being guided by stars to new lands after the waters recede. The Sumerian Zeus Sudra, the Mesopotamian Noah, is said to have found safety when the gods revealed the constellations. In Polynesian tradition, the survivors of great storms follow star paths to islands that seem to have been waiting for them. Even the Hebrew narrative of a rainbow after the flood could be read as a memory of the sky, as a vast guide and promise, the stars returning after endless rain. All of this suggests a continuity of sky watching, far older than our written records. It also explains why ancient people built monuments that married earth and sky, stone and star. The builders weren't just worshipping the heavens, they were mapping them. Those structures might have been the first data points of a lost science. Temples that doubled as observatories, calendars, and textbooks in stone. What's remarkable is how those same star patterns and mythic figures repeat across time and space. The constellation Orion, for instance, appears in Egyptian, Greek, Mayan, and Aboriginal lore, often associated with a great hunter, warrior, or teacher. The Pleiades, a cluster of small stars, appear in stories from Japan to the Americas, often tied to beginnings or migration. These shared constellations are like fingerprints left by the first astronomers, their meanings carried across the world by oral tradition. If those myths really are memories, then they preserve not just stories, but coordinates, reminders of how the first people oriented themselves in both space and time. The heavens became their library, a permanent record when the earth itself was unstable. In a world recovering from disaster, looking up must have offered comfort. The land might shift, but the stars were constant. Watching them could have been a way to feel connected to a larger order, to something enduring. Maybe that's why myths so often describe the gods as descending from the sky rather than emerging from the earth. The sky represented knowledge that outlived chaos. At some point, though, the relationship between heaven and earth reversed. The civilizations grew confident. The sky became less a teacher and more a mystery to conquer. Temples turned into towers. Observatories became monuments of power. But even in those grand projects, the old memory persisted. The architects still aligned their creations with the stars, still embedded ancient geometry into their designs. Even when they no longer remembered why, the habit remained. In that way, myth continued doing its quiet work. It preserved not only the story of the gods, but their mathematics, their measures, their maps. When modern scientists analyze ancient monuments, they often find consistent ratios, proportions that mirror the movements of planets, the tilt of the Earth, or the precession of the equinoxes. It's as though the builders encoded cosmic cycles into stone, ensuring that the rhythm of the heavens would never be forgotten. That persistence of pattern across millennia suggests that knowledge survived in disguise. Myths of sky gods may have kept alive the principles of astronomy long after the civilizations that discovered them were gone. The builders didn't just remember that the stars were important, they remembered how to measure them, how to translate their paths into architecture. It's worth imagining what kind of civilization could have begun that tradition. Not necessarily one with machines or metals, but one with time. Time to observe, to calculate, to pass knowledge down carefully enough that it could endure an age of forgetting. A civilization defined not by technology, but by continuity. Perhaps that's why we find its traces in myth rather than in ruins. Stories survive better than stone. There's another detail that recurs in myths of the sky gods. They often promise to return. Quetzalcoatl sails east, vowing to come back when the world is ready. The Egyptian Osiris becomes a star in the night sky, watching over humanity until the end of time. Even the Hebrew and Christian traditions preserve this pattern. A teacher who ascends to the heavens with a promise to return. These aren't just prophecies, they're reminders. Somewhere deep down, humanity might still be waiting for the return of its teachers. The memory of that first knowledge coming back to us. When we look at how far we've come, it's easy to think we've surpassed our ancestors. But maybe what we've really done is rediscover what they already knew. We've learned to map the stars again, to measure the earth again, to reach for the heavens again. Perhaps progress is just another word for remembering, and so the sky gods remain with us, not as literal deities, but as the lingering impression of those who once charted both earth and heaven. They taught us how to look up, and in doing so, how to understand where we stand. The mapmakers left no written instructions, only stories and alignments, enough for us to find our way back when the time was right. We're still following those maps now, though we call them by different names. Satellites trace orbits where myths once placed gods. Astronomers read the same stars that ancient priests recorded. The night sky that once inspired temples now powers technology. But the impulse behind both is the same, the desire to understand where we come from and what came before us. If the first civilization truly existed, its greatest achievement may not have been architecture or science, but communication. The ability to leave messages across 10,000 years, encoded in myth and starlight. And as we trace those messages, we begin to see the outlines of what they were trying to preserve. A memory of balance between earth and sky, knowledge and humility, memory and meaning. Somewhere out there, scattered across deserts and jungles and ocean floors, there may still be pieces of their maps waiting to be found. But the larger map, the one written in the constellations and carried in our stories, was never really lost. It's still above us, the same sky they watched, the same silent teacher. And as the old myths fade into the modern night, we can almost hear what they were saying all along, that the gods of the sky were once people of the earth, and that remembering them is how we remember ourselves. The stars may have guided our ancestors' eyes upward, but the earth is where their hands told the rest of the story. Somewhere between heaven and stone, humanity began to build, not merely to shelter or to mark territory, but to remember. Across the world, from the sands of Egypt to the jungles of Central America, from the high plateaus of Peru to the valleys of Turkey, we find structures that defy the simple explanations of time and tools. They stand as if the earth itself was persuaded to take shape, as if someone long ago knew how to coax rock into order with more precision than we can easily understand. When you look at them closely, you start to feel the same quiet question echoing through each site. Who built these, and how? The precision of the joints, the weight of the stones, the astronomical alignments, they seem to whisper of a skill that appeared too early, as if humanity woke one morning already remembering how to build. Take the Great Pyramids of Giza. Each block weighs several tons, shaped and placed with such accuracy that even today with lasers and cranes, we'd struggle to replicate it perfectly at that scale. The Great Pyramid alone contains over 2 million blocks, each fitted so tightly that even a sheet of paper can't slide between them. Its sides align almost perfectly with the cardinal directions, deviating by mere fractions of a degree. Is not just a monument, it's a measurement, a marker of both time and geography, encoding ratios that match the circumference of the Earth. That's not something you stumble upon by accident. We call it Egyptian genius, and it certainly was, but some aspects seem older than Egypt itself. The builders of Giza claim their civilization descended from an earlier time, a golden age, under the guidance of gods who taught them architecture, writing, and order. Those gods, they said, came from the stars from the lands before the flood. Their names changed through the centuries, but the memory stayed. Travel far across the ocean, and the same pattern appears again. In South America, the Inca built walls that look almost fluid, stones shaped to fit together with organic precision, like muscles rather than bricks. At Sacsayhuaman in Peru, enormous blocks weighing hundreds of tons interlock with a perfection so tight that modern engineers still debate how it was done. The shapes are irregular, yet they form a stable structure without mortar, resistant to earthquakes. The builders understood geometry and stress distribution on a level that seems far beyond trial and error. What makes this even stranger is that these walls were built on top of older foundations. Beneath Incan stonework lie even more ancient stones, larger and more finely cut, belonging to a people the Inca themselves had came before them. Local legends speak of the Viracocha, tall, pale-skinned teachers who arrived after a great flood, teaching the survivors how to build and measure. The same pattern again, a flood, visitors from the heavens or across the sea, and the sudden appearance of advanced building. In the high Altiplano of Bolivia lies Puma Punku, a site so puzzling that it feels almost out of place in time. There, blocks of diorite, one of the hardest stones on Earth, are carved with millimeter precision, featuring perfect right angles and interlocking grooves as if they were machined. Yet, they are thousands of years old, built long before metal tools or wheels are supposed to have existed in that region. Some of the blocks weigh over 100 tons. The site lies over 12,000 feet above sea level, far from any known quarry large enough to have supplied the material. No one knows how the builders cut, transported, or assembled them. It's the same story across the world. On Easter Island, massive Moai statues stand like silent witnesses to forgotten engineers. In Lebanon, at Baalbek sits the Trilithon, 3 limestone blocks, each weighing over 800 tons, stacked with mathematical accuracy. No pulley system or crane we know of from ancient times could have moved them. Yet there they are, aligned, deliberate, waiting for explanation. These monuments don't just suggest skill, they suggest continuity. The same architectural intelligence appears in places supposedly separated by oceans and millennia. The same use of cyclopean stones, the same attention to celestial alignment, the same obsession with durability. If these were independent inventions, the coincidences are extraordinary. If they were connected, fragments of a shared heritage, then perhaps they are the surviving language of that first civilization, expressed not in words, but in stone. Stone doesn't decay like wood or parchment. It survives catastrophe, flood, and fire. If you wanted to preserve knowledge through the collapse of an age, you'd carve it into the most durable material you could find. Maybe that's what these builders were doing, not just constructing temples or tombs, but encoding data, messages for the future, ratios, alignments, proportions, a language of mathematics and geometry that could speak across time. In many ancient sites, the stones seem to hum with that purpose. Not literally, of course, but conceptually. They carry an intelligence that feels designed for endurance. Even when the original culture faded, the structures endured, becoming part of the landscape itself. Later generations built upon them, worshipped among them, told stories about the gods who had raised them. In that way, memory became material. The myth of the first builders transformed into the sacred architecture of their descendants. The people of Mesopotamia called their temples ziggurats, stairways between heaven and earth. The Bible speaks of the Tower of Babel, a structure meant to reach the heavens, built by humans who had once shared one language. The gods, angered or weary, scattered them and confused their speech. Beneath the myth lies something curious, the idea that there was once a universal language, one of understanding and shared knowledge, broken apart after an ambitious act of construction. Maybe that story isn't about hubris at all. Maybe it's about loss, the fragmentation of a civilization that once knew how to build together and then forgot. If you trace that story through time, you find it echoing in other places. The Greek myth of the Titans describes a race of beings who built vast works before being cast down. The Mayans spoke of earlier worlds, each destroyed and rebuilt, with the last one ending when the gods overturned mountains and cities. In the Middle East, tales of the Nephilim describe giants who raised great structures before the flood wiped them away. Again and again, the image repeats. Great builders wiped from history, leaving only impossible stones behind. To modern minds, these stories sound like allegory, but maybe they're fragments of memory, from a time when building with stone was not just a craft, but a language, a way of recording truth that could outlast disaster. The scale of these works isn't about vanity, it's about survival. If you've watched entire cities vanish beneath water or fire, you'd want the next ones to endure. You'd build them to resist everything you'd already seen destroy the world once before. It's worth noting how often these ancient structures are aligned with the stars. The builders were not only engineers, they were astronomers. The orientation of the Great Pyramid mirrors the motion of Orion. The temples of Angkor Wat align with solstices. The stones of Machu Picchu mark the equinox sunrise. It's as though every monument on Earth was part of a single planetary observatory, each piece reflecting the same cosmic order. The knowledge required to achieve this precision across continents suggests not isolation, but a shared origin of method, a blueprint older than any one culture. If that's true, then the builders of impossible stone weren't isolated geniuses. They were the inheritors of a unified system of knowledge, geometry, astronomy, and sacred proportion handed down from the memory of the first civilization. When the flood erased the cities, the math survived. It resurfaced wherever people were ready to remember it again. We sometimes assume that the ancient world was less capable than ours, that technology moves only forward, but the deeper we look, the more we find evidence of skill that doesn't fit the narrative. The precision of Machu Picchu's terraces, which prevent erosion on steep mountainsides, matches modern engineering standards. The acoustic design of Chichen Itza, where a clap beneath the pyramid produces the sound of a bird's call through echo, reveals knowledge of sound physics. The mortarless walls of Cusco have withstood centuries of earthquakes that destroyed later buildings. These are not coincidences. They are mastery, inherited, remembered, or rediscovered from somewhere beyond written history. What's most intriguing is that the same principles appear in cultures that never met. Ratios like the golden mean, alignments with solstices, and specific geometric constants reoccur across time. In Egypt, in Greece, in Mesoamerica, in Asia, the same mathematical fingerprints appear. Could it be that these civilizations were drawing from a shared memory, an inherited intuition of proportion encoded deep within culture itself? The philosopher Pythagoras claimed his knowledge of geometry came from Egypt, and that Egypt had inherited it from an even older source. Plato wrote that architecture should reflect the harmony of the cosmos. In India, the Vedic texts describe sacred geometry as the blueprint of creation itself. Everywhere we look, the idea persists that the act of building is a reflection of something eternal, that when humans shape stone, they are imitating the order of the universe. That idea could be symbolic, but it could also be literal. The builders might have believed they were restoring a pattern, rebuilding what had been lost, and maybe, in their quiet way, they were right. When we visit these places today, we often see them as ruins. We forget that for thousands of years they were alive, temples of light and shadow, tuned to the movement of the sun. At dawn, beams of light slide between stones, illuminating carvings that mark equinoxes or solstices with precision that rivals modern observatories. The builders weren't worshipping the sun, they were synchronizing with it. Each structure was a clock, a calendar, a reminder that time and space are not separate from human life, but woven through it. It's possible that this synchronization was the central achievement of the first civilization. They didn't just measure the heavens, they lived in rhythm with them. Their buildings weren't random or decorative, they were instruments of alignment, designed to harmonize human existence with the cosmos. The stones we now see as mysterious monuments may once have been parts of a system, a global architecture meant to preserve balance between earth and sky. If that's the case, then maybe the most important thing the builders left us wasn't their structures, but their method to observe, to measure, to remember, and to build with purpose. That method has survived quietly, embedded in art, in mathematics, in myth. The impulse to shape the world in harmony with the heavens didn't vanish with them. It reappeared in cathedrals aligned to solstice light, in temples mirrored after constellations, in modern architecture that still seeks symmetry with the natural world. The memory continues to express itself, even if we no longer recognize its source. The builders of impossible stone may have been the last to truly remember that source. Their ruins are not just evidence of skill, but fragments of continuity, the last visible link to the world before the flood. If we could decode their language fully, we might uncover not just how they built, but why. And maybe the answer is simple. Maybe they built because they knew the world forgets. They had seen it happen once, and they refused to let it happen again. So they left behind markers that could not drown, could not burn, could not rot. Messages in the hardest medium available for future eyes to rediscover. Every stone is a sentence, every alignment a word. Together, they form a story so vast, we're still learning to read it. A story of how memory became architecture, and how architecture became the bridge between worlds. And as we move deeper into that story, the stones lead us towards something even more mysterious. The knowledge those builders carried, the secrets they claimed to have inherited from gods or ancestors who came before the flood. the lost wisdom that once linked heaven, earth, and human understanding. That's where the next part of our journey begins, among the scattered clues of a forgotten science, one that speaks of energies, alignments, and technologies that may have been less about machines and more about memory itself. Knowledge, unlike stone or fire, is invisible until someone remembers it. You can hold a tool, you can see a monument, but the knowledge that shaped them vanishes the moment a culture forgets. What remains is the result, not the process. Somewhere deep in our past, humanity crossed a boundary between remembering and rediscovering. We still live with the echoes of that crossing, the quiet awareness that there are things we once knew, but no longer understand. It's strange to think that civilization might not have been a single invention, but a reawakening. If the builders of impossible stone were the inheritors of a memory, then the question becomes, what exactly were they trying to preserve? What was so valuable, so fragile that they built entire mountains of stone to encode it? Ancient myths hint at an answer. They speak of gifts from the gods, the knowledge of writing, the secrets of metallurgy, the art of healing, the ability to move great weights, to read the stars, to summon energy from the earth itself. To the people recording these tales thousands of years later, such abilities seemed supernatural. But what if they weren't? What if they were simply the residual skills of a civilization that had once mastered the natural world in ways we've since? The traces of this forgotten science are scattered across the world, hiding in plain sight. The alignment of temples to magnetic north, the acoustic precision of ancient amphitheaters, the chemical mastery of pigments that haven't faded in thousands of years, the precision carving of hard stone without visible tool marks. These aren't miracles, they're technologies of understanding, but the people who inherited them no longer knew how they worked. They repeated the gestures without grasping the principles. In that sense, much of early civilization might have been built on the ghost of a knowledge older than its own memory. Consider the question of how ancient builders moved stones weighing hundreds of tons without cranes, wheels, or iron. The official explanations often come down to combinations of ropes, sleds, and manpower, and perhaps in some cases, that's true, but the precision and scale of certain constructions make those answers feel incomplete. The blocks of Baalbek, the H-blocks of Puma Punku, the foundation stones of Cusco, these don't just suggest strength, they suggest control. Some researchers have speculated about lost techniques involving sound, resonance, or magnetism. Others suggest advanced methods of softening stone using chemical processes hinted at in obscure texts. We don't know which, if any, are correct. What we do know is that these builders achieve things we still struggle to replicate. Across many cultures, there are myths about music, vibration, or voice as tools of creation. The Egyptians said, the god Thoth spoke the world into order. In India, the concept of the primordial sound is described as the vibration from which all things arise. In the Bible, creation begins with the word. In the highlands of Tibet, monks have long used sound to move and shape materials in rituals that seem symbolic, yet may recall a deeper principle. Perhaps these stories aren't metaphorical. Perhaps they're remnants of a time when people understood the physical power of sound and vibration, not as mysticism, but as applied physics. It's easy to forget that knowledge doesn't always appear in the same form. What we call science today, observation, experimentation, measurement, may once have been practiced through ritual, song, and architecture. The ancients may not have separated their understanding of the world into categories like religion, art, and technology. To them, those were all expressions of the same insight that the world has patterns. And by aligning with those patterns, you can create harmony, stability, even power. In that way, the lost knowledge of the deep past might not have been about machines, but about resonance, understanding how natural forces interact, how energy flows through earth, water, sound, and life. The megalithic sites of the ancient world often sit on what geologists now recognize as geomagnetic anomalies, or intersections of telluric currents. Subtle flows of electromagnetic energy within the Earth. Many of these places amplify sound, light, or magnetic response in ways that suggest deliberate placement. It's as if the builders knew how to tune the Earth like an instrument, constructing monuments not only to observe the heavens, but to connect with the energies below. At Stonehenge, the stones are positioned so that even a whisper carries across the circle. In the Hippo of Malta, low frequencies resonate through the chamber with uncanny depth, producing measurable effects on human brainwaves. In the Great Pyramid, certain frequencies echo in a way that enhances sound at specific pitches, as if the chambers were designed for acoustic experimentation. These effects might be coincidences, or they might be remnants of a forgotten science of energy, not the energy of electricity or fuel, but of harmonics and resonance, the subtle interactions between sound, vibration, and structure. If that sounds speculative, it's worth remembering that modern science has only recently begun to explore the physical effects of resonance in materials and biology. Ultrasound, vibration therapy, somatics. These are contemporary rediscoveries of principles that might once have been part of a broader, older understanding. The ancients may not have had our language for it, but they might have known its reality. In their myths, the act of creation is almost always described as tuning. Gods shape the world by speaking, singing, or striking. The universe is born not from silence, but from rhythm. That idea is mirrored in modern physics. Everything that exists vibrates from atoms to galaxies. Energy, matter, and sound are connected at their core. If the first civilization understood this intuitively, their monuments might have been built not only for physical stability, but for energetic harmony, each structure a chord in the larger symphony of the world. It's also possible that this knowledge included understanding the relationship between the earth and the heavens, how celestial cycles influence climate, growth, and human behavior. Many ancient calendars were not just records of time, but predictive models. They tracked planetary alignments, eclipses, and solstices with a precision that still amazes astronomers. These systems require generations of observation and a framework of mathematics far older than recorded history. In the ruins of ancient Sumer, we find evidence of sophisticated mathematics, including base 60 number systems and knowledge of pi. In Egypt, the dimensions of the pyramids encode ratios that match the Earth's curvature and solar year. In Mesoamerica, the Mayan calendar predicts planetary cycles with near-perfect accuracy. These achievements appear independently, but they may have been fragments of a once unified knowledge, pieces of a worldview that saw the universe as a living, measurable system. If we step back, we can see a pattern forming. The myths of gods descending from the sky might reflect the transmission of this knowledge. The builders of impossible stone might have used it to preserve the memory of their teachers, and the monuments themselves might be textbooks written in geometry instead of ink, designed to survive the next flood of forgetting. Knowledge stored in myth has a peculiar resilience. It can't be destroyed, only misinterpreted. The details shift, but the core remains. You see it in how the same mathematical constants, pi, the golden ratio, the square root of 2, appear in sacred architecture across continents. You see it in the repetition of certain symbols, the spiral, the serpent, the tree, the sun. These are not arbitrary decorations. They are shorthand for principles. The serpent, for example, often represents energy or motion, from the Kundalini in India to the Ouroboros in Greece, to the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl in the Fu wrapper, and Silis. The spiral represents cycles, continuity, and transformation. These images may be the residue of a symbolic language used to encode scientific understanding in a form that emotion and memory could carry. Even now, we find ourselves returning to those same symbols in our art and science. The spiral appears in our galaxies, our DNA, our weather systems. The serpent's form resembles the wave pattern of energy fields. It's as if the symbols persist because they're not arbitrary. They're accurate. The people who used them weren't just telling stories. They were describing reality in the only language that could survive catastrophe. And then there's the question of why that knowledge disappeared. Civilizations rise and fall, but certain kinds of understanding tend to survive. Agriculture, metallurgy, writing. Yet, some knowledge seems to have been deliberately hidden, mythologized, or encoded so deeply that it took thousands of years to resurface. Maybe it wasn't lost by accident. Maybe it was protected. If a great catastrophe had nearly wiped out humanity once before, those who survived might have chosen to preserve their knowledge indirectly, disguising it as myth to prevent misuse. Instead of leaving written manuals that could be misread or misused, they left stories and symbols that would only reveal their meaning to those who approached them with curiosity and humility. In that sense, myth would act as a safeguard, a self-protecting archive of truth. That idea might sound romantic, but it fits what we know about oral cultures. In societies without writing, sacred knowledge is often hidden within ritual, song, or allegory, revealed only to initiates after years of preparation. The knowledge isn't secret because it's forbidden, it's secret because it requires a certain way of seeing to understand. The first civilization, if it existed, might have operated under the same principle. Their science was not written in formulas, but woven into the patterns of the world, waiting for rediscovery. When you look at the progression of human knowledge through this lens, it feels less like invention and more like remembering. Every few centuries, we rediscover something our ancestors seemed to hint at: the shape of the atom, the movement of the stars, the nature of vibration. We give it new names, new frameworks, but the core principles echo. Modern physics describes reality as a field of probabilities and waves, an interconnected web of energy rather than a collection of isolated objects. Ancient wisdom described the same thing in mythic terms: the world as a living organism, the divine as the energy that connects all things. Perhaps the difference isn't in what they knew, but how they described it. It's tempting to imagine that the first civilization might have reached a level of understanding that blurred the line between science and spirituality, not in the mystical sense, but in the recognition that both seek the same truth through different languages. They might have understood that matter and mind, energy and consciousness are part of the same spectrum. That understanding could have shaped how they built, how they healed, how they lived. Their temples might have been laboratories as much as sanctuaries. Their rituals, experiments in harmonizing with natural forces. If that was their legacy, it's no wonder later generations remembered them as gods. Compared to the fragmented understanding of those who came after, their knowledge would have seemed infinite. Yet, even as their monuments fell and their books vanished, the echoes persisted in geometry, in myth, in the faint memory that the world once made perfect sense. Every rediscovery we make today, from quantum entanglement to bioresonance to the fractal nature of the universe, feels like a step back toward that lost coherence. We're relearning what the ancients may have already known: that the universe is not a collection of separate parts, but a single vibrating whole. The lost knowledge of the deep past may never be fully recovered in its original form. Too much time has passed, too many translations and reinterpretations. But maybe recovery isn't the point. Maybe the purpose of that ancient memory is simply to remind us that knowing is possible, that we've done this before and can do it again. As we follow the trail of these myths and monuments, we begin to sense that what was lost was not just knowledge, but continuity, the unbroken chain between observation, understanding, and meaning. The ancients didn't study the world to control it, they studied it to belong to it. Somewhere along the line, we forgot that difference. And so, the question isn't whether we can find the lost knowledge, but whether we can learn to listen to the fragments we already have. The stones, the stories, the symbols, they're all still speaking, just softly. To hear them, we have to quiet the noise of certainty and let curiosity do what it's always done best. Remember, in the ruins of old temples and the lines of forgotten myth, something still hums. Not just the sound of ancient hands at work, but the echo of understanding itself. It's waiting for us to notice, as it always has. And if we keep following that hum, it leads somewhere even deeper into the great forgetting that nearly ended it all. The point where history slipped beneath the tide and memory became myth. Forgetting doesn't happen all at once. It creeps in quietly, like mist rolling across a landscape, until even the familiar becomes uncertain. One generation forgets a word, the next forgets its meaning, and soon an entire story fades. Somewhere in humanity's long memory, there was a point where remembering became too heavy to carry. The world changed, the old ways no longer fit, and the knowledge that had once defined existence began to slip away. What we call the dawn of history might just as easily have been the dusk of something far older. If the first civilization really existed, its end wasn't a single moment, not a single flood or fire, but a slow unraveling, a series of losses layered over time until the thread connecting memory to meaning finally snapped. When we look at the ruins scattered across continents, we see what remains after forgetting. Temples turn to sand, names turn to echoes. But what's harder to see are the absences, the things that should be there and aren't, the missing connections, the silent intervals between inventions, the sudden gaps in understanding that appear like voids in a once continuous story. Somewhere around 12,000 years ago, the Earth's climate stabilized after millennia of chaos. Seas settled into their new shapes. Forests returned. Human populations grew again. Yet, instead of continuity, what follows is disjunction. Technologies appear without clear ancestry. Knowledge surfaces abruptly and without precedent. It's as though people woke up one day with fragments of memory they couldn't quite explain. You can see it in the archaeology. The builders of Göbekli erected vast stone enclosures aligned with the stars, then buried them deliberately and walked away. The people of Sumer, the supposed first civilization, began recording complex mathematics, laws, and architecture almost as soon as they invented writing. The Egyptians appeared with hieroglyphs, calendars, and astronomy already fully formed. The Indus Valley cities had plumbing and standardized weights, but left behind no readable texts. None of these cultures seem to have truly begun from zero. Each one acts like a society, rediscovering what it once knew, guided by instinct rather than invention. The great forgetting may have been the price of survival. After catastrophe, after generations of rebuilding, priorities shift. The need to endure outweighs the need to remember. Knowledge becomes local again, specialized, practical. Stories that once encoded science become myths told to children. The memory of why fades, but the memory of what remains. Rituals, measurements, symbols, the underlying logic disappears, and what's left is repetition without understanding. That's how memory turns into superstition. A ritual that once measured solstice alignment becomes a ceremony performed because it's tradition. A carving that once represented a mathematical ratio becomes the face of a god. The knowledge remains, but its meaning drifts like a language spoken phonetically by someone who no longer knows what the words mean. Over generations, those fragments become religion, art, and myth. What was once instruction becomes inspiration. The strange thing is that this transformation isn't necessarily a failure. In a way, it's what allowed the memory to survive at all. A scientific formula can vanish with a single burned library, but a story told and retold endures. The ancients may have known this, embedding their understanding in narrative precisely because it could survive catastrophe. In that sense, forgetting wasn't destruction. It was adaptation. Knowledge went underground, disguised as myth, waiting to be rediscovered by a world ready to listen again. But there's still a question that lingers. What could have caused such widespread amnesia? If humanity had reached a level of global sophistication once before, what could have erased it so completely? The obvious answer is nature. The end of the Ice Age brought immense floods, earthquakes, and climate shifts. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that a comet, or fragments of one, struck the Earth roughly 1,200 years ago, triggering rapid cooling and widespread fires. Geological evidence shows layers of black carbon and microscopic glass spirals consistent with cosmic impact. If true, the event would have caused near global destruction, wiping out coastal populations and resetting civilization to its foundations. To the survivors, it would have felt like the wrath of gods: fire in the sky, oceans boiling, darkness lasting for years. Even if a few centers of knowledge endured, their world would have been shattered. Over centuries, survivors would migrate, rebuild, and tell their children what had happened. By the time those stories became myths, the details would have faded, but the emotion would remain. The fear of the sky, the reverence for the gods, the instincts to start again. Yet, forgetting is rarely just environmental. Sometimes it's cultural. When societies change too fast, they can lose their own context. After the fall of Rome, for example, much of Europe lost the knowledge of concrete, road-making, and sanitation. Entire libraries disappeared, not through catastrophe, but through neglect. Monks copied religious texts, but ignored technical ones, not out of malice, but because they no longer understood their purpose. Civilization regressed, not because of ignorance, but because the connection between knowledge and meaning had broken. If that could happen in a few centuries, what might happen in a few thousand? The same pattern appears again and again. The Maya built vast cities aligned with stars, then abandoned them for reasons still debated. The technology to cut and move Incan stones vanished long before the Spanish arrived. Even the builders of the great ziggurats eventually forgot how their ancestors measured the heavens. It's not that people stopped thinking, it's that they stopped remembering. The world moved on, leaving fragments of wisdom stranded like islands in the ocean of time. In some ways, the great forgetting might have been psychological as much as historical. Trauma can suppress memory on a collective scale. If an entire civilization witnessed its world destroyed, the survivors might carry that trauma for generations, encoding it in stories of divine punishment, of floods and falls, of forbidden knowledge that led to ruin. Forgetting becomes protection. To survive, they had to let go of what reminded them of loss. Knowledge itself may have been seen as dangerous, a temptation to rebuild what the gods had destroyed. You can see this fear in later myths. In the story of Prometheus, the gift of fire, symbol of knowledge, brings punishment. In Genesis, the tree of knowledge leads to exile. In Sumerian legend, the god Enki warns humanity not to reveal certain secrets. These stories might not just be moral lessons. They could be echoes of a time when knowledge was literally perilous, when remembering too much about the old world risked repeating its destruction. And yet, even as forgetting spread, the memory never vanished entirely. It hid in symbols, in geometry, in architecture. People built pyramids, temples, and cities, not because they fully understood the old principles, but because something inside them still responded to those shapes. The golden ratio, the sacred circle, the alignment with the rising sun. These weren't random, they were inherited intuitions, fragments of a deeper understanding that persisted even when the conscious memory was gone. It's possible that the great forgetting wasn't a complete eraser, but a kind of dormancy. The knowledge didn't die, it went quiet, waiting for a time when humans would once again, for a Greta, be curious enough to notice the patterns, to ask why the old stories repeat. Every rediscovery since then, from geometry to astronomy to medicine, like the humanity remembering what it once knew, one piece at a time. In that sense, history is less a straight line and more a spiral. We circle the same truths again and again, each time a little higher, a little clearer. The ancients may have known that too. Many of their symbols, the serpent eating its tail, the endless wheel, express this idea of cyclical remembering. Forgetting isn't the end of knowledge, it's part of its rhythm. Each cycle of loss and rediscovery deepens our understanding, even as it erases the details. But what does it mean for us now? Living in an age defined by information rather than memory, we assume that storing data means preserving knowledge, yet data without context is just noise. The ancients understood something we've nearly forgotten again, that memory is not about accumulation, but connection. It's not enough to keep facts. You have to know how they fit together, how they belong. When that sense of belonging breaks, knowledge turns hollow. It survives in fragments, but loses its meaning. That perhaps was the real heart of the great forgetting, not the loss of facts, but the loss of coherence. There are moments in history when we seem to catch glimpses of what was lost. During the Renaissance, scholars rediscovered ancient Greek and Roman texts and were stunned by the sophistication of ideas that had been forgotten for over 1,000 years. The same thing happens on a larger scale when archaeologists uncover sites like Göbekli or Pumapunku, evidence of complexity where simplicity was expected. Each discovery is a reminder that forgetting is never complete, that memory lingers in the earth, waiting to be found. Sometimes the memory returns in stranger ways, through intuition, invention, or inspiration. There are stories of inventors who claim to have dreamed solutions they couldn't logically explain. Nikola Tesla spoke of ideas arriving fully formed in his mind, as if remembered rather than conceived. Across disciplines, breakthroughs often feel less like creation and more like rediscovery. It's as if the mind is tapping into something older, something collective, a shared memory beyond time. That idea, though difficult to prove, feels consistent with what myth has always implied, that human consciousness itself carries echoes of the past. The great forgetting may have wiped clean the records of the first civilization, but its memory might still live within us, surfacing through imagination, curiosity, and the constant urge to build, to measure, to understand. The desire to create order out of chaos, to reach for the stars, to align with them, to build monuments that defy time. That's not new, it's ancient. Perhaps forgetting was necessary. A reset, a chance for humanity to rebuild with fresh eyes, free from the weight of too much knowledge. The first civilization might have fallen under its own understanding, for mastering forces it couldn't control. Forgetting would then be the mercy of nature, a way to begin again without the burden of past mistakes. The cycle of loss and rediscovery might be part of the balance that keeps us humble. We forget so that we can remember differently. Even now, traces of the great forgetting linger in how we think about history. We treat progress as linear, as if knowledge accumulates neatly over time. But deep down, we sense the truth is messier. Every library, every monument, every story carries the faint signature of things half remembered and half lost. Each discovery we make feels both new and ancient, as if we've been here before. And maybe we have. Maybe the ruins we study are not the relics of a different species or a separate age, but the remains of an earlier version of ourselves, humanity, and a previous cycle of remembering and forgetting. If so, then history isn't just about learning who we were, but about recognizing that we've been more than once what we are now. That thought isn't bleak. It's comforting in a way. It means that forgetting is never final, that knowledge never truly dies. It waits buried in story, in symbol, in stone, until someone notices the pattern again, until curiosity burns through the fog and memory begins to return. Somewhere under the layers of time, the memory of that first world still hums, a quiet vibration beneath the noise of history. We catch it sometimes in myths that refuse to fade, in alignments that still mark the sun, in the haunting feeling that our ancestors knew something essential we'd only begun to remember. The great forgetting may have scattered that knowledge, but it didn't destroy it. It only hid it long enough for us to seek it new. And as we listen more closely, we begin to hear voices carried through the ages, the storytellers, the builders, the astronomers, each one preserving a fragment of what was lost. Their memories flow through us still, shaping the way we think and dream. It's through those voices that the next part of our journey begins, following the echoes of the old world as they pass through generations, transforming from knowledge into myth, from fact into fable, and finally, back into curiosity. Because even in forgetting, humanity never truly lets go of its story. It just waits for someone somewhere to remember the tune. Somewhere between silence and language, there's a space where memory waits. It doesn't live in libraries or stone tablets. It lives in rhythm, in sound, in the cadence of a voice that knows how to keep something alive by saying it aloud. When written history fades, spoken words become the bridge. That's how memory traveled across the millennia, through stories carried in the air from mouth to ear, generation after generation. If the great forgetting scattered the pieces of the first civilization, the storytellers were the ones who began gathering them back. Every culture on Earth has its keepers of memory. Griots, shamans, poets, priests, elders. Their role was never just entertainment. It was preservation. In a world without paper or machines, they were the living archives of experience. They remembered lineages, migrations, laws, and histories, but also the mysteries, the myths that hinted at the time before. Imagine a night 10,000 years ago. A group of people huddle around a fire at the edge of the wilderness. Beyond the light, there's only darkness, the kind that hums with life. The storyteller begins. His voice is slow and measured, shaped by countless retellings. He's not reciting from memory the way we memorize facts. He's invoking something alive, something that moves through him. Every gesture, every pause, is part of the transmission. Those listening aren't passive. They're participating, breathing with the rhythm, anticipating familiar turns. When he speaks of gods descending from the sky, or oceans swallowing cities, the listeners nod, not in disbelief, but in recognition. They've heard it before, and their children will hear it again. That's how knowledge survived when writing didn't exist. It wasn't stored, it was performed. Each telling renewed the memory, reshaped it to fit the time and place. That adaptability is what made it last. Even when the facts faded, the structure remained. The bones of truth carried within story. That's why the same myth can appear on different continents, wearing different names but telling the same story. The performance outlived the details. In this way, oral tradition became humanity's original network, a system of distributed memory stretching across space and time. It connected generations, linking ancestors to descendants through repetition and rhythm. You can see echoes of it today in chants, prayers, and songs that have survived thousands of years almost unchanged. The structure of verse and meter wasn't just art, it was a mnemonic device. Rhythm made memory durable. A story set to cadence was easier to remember, harder to lose. Across the world, ancient peoples used this system to preserve what mattered most. In Polynia, navigators memorized entire ocean routes using songs that encoded star paths, wind patterns, and currents. In West Africa, Go recited dynastic histories stretching back centuries, each name preserved through careful training. In the Vik tradition of India, priests memorized sacred texts, tens of thousands of words long, passing them unchanged for millennia through precise chanting. These were not simple feats of memory. They were acts of devotion, a recognition that remembering was sacred work. When we look at the oldest myths, we often underestimate how deliberate they are. They weren't random stories told for amusement. They were compressed data, knowledge encoded in metaphor, so it could survive translation across time. The flood stories, the sky gods, the builders, all of them were carried through this oral lineage, and as they traveled, they changed shape, adapting to new languages and landscapes. But the core remained. There's an odd consistency in how those stories behave. The oldest ones don't fade, they evolve. They appear in different regions, dressed in local imagery. Yet, the structure is recognizable. The flood always comes after an age of hubris. The gods always descend from the sky. The golden age always ends in catastrophe. These aren't coincidences. They're the fingerprints of a memory, too large to fit in one language, stretching itself to survive. When writing finally appeared, it didn't replace oral tradition. It froze it. Myths that had once been fluid became fixed, carved into stone, or pressed into clay. That's why the earliest written records feel both ancient and incomplete. They're like photographs of something that had been moving for thousands of years. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest written works we have, is a snapshot of a much older oral tradition. The same story existed in spoken form long before someone decided to record it. Writing gave humanity permanence, but it also created distance. Once words could be stored outside the body, the connection between speaker and story weakened. The oral storyteller lived inside the narrative. The scribe observed it. The written word preserved information but lost intimacy. Yet, even as writing spread, the oral voice continued, especially where memory was too sacred to trust to fragile materials. In many indigenous cultures, certain stories are still never written down. They're considered living beings to be spoken only at specific times or by specific people. That's an echo of the ancient world. When memory itself was alive, if we imagine that the first civilization existed, its memory must have survived in this way. After the Great Forgetting, the knowledge of who they were and what they had done would have fragmented into stories. Some of those stories would become creation myths, others would become rituals, a few would survive as direct memories, distorted but intact enough to hint at their origin, and those fragments would spread with the migrations of people carried like seeds to new lands. Modern linguistics and anthropology often reveal just how far those seeds traveled. Themes that appear in Sumerian or Egyptian myth also appear in Native American and Polynesian traditions. Despite the impossibility of contact, the idea of divine teachers, of floods, of lost lands, of knowledge descending from the heavens, it's everywhere. If we look at myth as data, the consistency becomes impossible to ignore. It's as though humanity has been trying to tell itself the same story for 10,000 years, but in 100 different dialects. The storytellers didn't just remember, they interpreted. Each generation added its own layer, sometimes blending new experiences with old symbols. That's why myth feels timeless. It's not about when it happened, but how it keeps happening. Every retelling is both ancient and new. Through this process, myth became more than memory. It became identity. It told people who they were, where they came from, and how they should live. For many indigenous cultures, myth isn't fiction or history. It's truth told through the only medium that can hold both fact and meaning at once: story. To them, the flood didn't happen once. It happens whenever balance is lost. The gods didn't visit once. They visit whenever knowledge returns. That's how oral memory stays relevant, by staying alive. There's a term some anthropologists use: deep time memory. It refers to the possibility that certain oral traditions preserve events from tens of thousands of years ago. In Australia, Aboriginal stories describe coastal landscapes that were flooded when sea levels rose after the Ice Age. Descriptions so detailed that they match modern geological reconstructions. In the Pacific Northwest, stories of fire from the sky aligned with evidence of ancient meteor impacts. These are not coincidences. They are examples of memory surviving far longer than we thought possible, shaped by storytelling to withstand the erosion of time. The same may be true for the myths of the first civilization. The details changed, but the structure endured. Somewhere in the rhythm of those stories lies the memory of who they were and what they lost. You can trace those rhythms through generations. The oldest languages often have words that mean both story and truth. In Samrian, the word nam carries meanings of both law and essence. In Sanskrit, Rita means both cosmic order and narrative truth. To the ancients, story wasn't just entertainment, it was alignment. To remember a myth was to participate in reality itself. Forgetting it meant falling out of harmony with the world. That's why the storytellers were sacred. They weren't inventors, they were custodians. Their role was to ensure continuity, to make sure the past wasn't entirely lost to the fog of forgetting. When they spoke, they were speaking for all who came before. Their voices carried the weight of millennia. In some cultures, this duty was literal. The Maori of New Zealand have oral genealogies that trace lineages back over 40 generations. The Dogon of Mali have priests who recite astronomical knowledge, encoded in myth, preserving information about star systems they couldn't possibly have observed. Among the Navajo, the chants used in healing ceremonies describe geological formations in ways that align with scientific observation. These traditions didn't emerge from imagination, they emerged from memory. Memory maintained through discipline, ritual, and repetition. It's humbling to think that the oldest technology of preservation isn't writing or architecture, but voice. The human brain, trained to rhythm and repetition, can carry entire libraries without ink. For thousands of years, that's how civilization remembered itself, through sound waves traveling from breath to ear, heartbeat to heartbeat. The continuity of culture depended on the people who could recite, perform, and recall. Without them, history would have dissolved completely. Even now, in the age of digital archives and cloud storage, that old system still echoes in how we communicate. Podcasts, audiobooks, radio, all descendants of the ancient fire circle. We still crave the sound of a voice, telling a story, because that's how our species first learned to understand time. Listening is an act of remembering, not just hearing. If we think of myth as the world's first recording device, then the storytellers were the custodians of the archive. And just as modern recordings can degrade, myths, too, can distort. Each generation added interpretation, blending fact with metaphor. But distortion isn't destruction, it's adaptation, the way memory stays alive, by becoming flexible. If the first civilization's story was carried forward in this way, then the differences between cultures aren't contradictions, they're variations of the same melody, adjusted for different listeners. Everywhere we look, that melody persists. The story of creation out of chaos, the flood that resets the world, the teacher who descends from the heavens, the builders who shape stone with impossible skill, the lost golden age when humans and gods lived side by side. These aren't random inventions, stare fragments of one long narrative, a song humanity has been singing to itself for as long as it's had a voice. Sometimes that song grows faint, and sometimes it returns with new strength. When archaeologists uncover a forgotten site or decode a lost language, it's as if we're hearing a verse we didn't know we'd forgotten. When a myth from one culture matches the symbols of another, half a world away, it's another harmony emerging from the static. The voices of the past don't disappear, they just move into different frequencies, waiting for us to tune in again. Perhaps that's why these stories still feel familiar. Even when stripped of their cultural details, they resonate in a way that's hard to explain. They trigger recognition, not through logic, but through emotion. It's the same feeling you get when hearing a melody you can't name, but somehow know. The myth speaks to something beneath understanding, a memory older than memory. The storytellers of old may not have known what we call science, but they understood transmission. They knew how to keep meaning alive through time. And maybe that's the greatest legacy of the first civilization. Not their monuments or their technologies, but their method of continuity. They taught us how to remember, even when we forget. Every time we tell a story, we're participating in that continuity. We're reactivating the oldest technology on Earth, the human voice, carrying knowledge forward. The myths we tell now about the universe, evolution technology, are modern chapters in the same endless story. They're our way of keeping the conversation with the past alive. If you listen closely, you can almost hear those ancient voices still speaking. They echo in the way we describe discovery, in our fascination with origins, in our instinct to look back, even as we move forward. They're the reason we keep asking who we are, where we came from, and what came before us. It's not curiosity alone, it's memory calling home. And as those echoes grow louder, they begin to form patterns, voices from different ages, different lands, converging into something larger, a collective story about the world before the flood, before forgetting, a story that might still be unfolding, one fragment at a time. Somewhere in that convergence lies a language older than speech, the language of symbols that connects all these stories, the universal grammar of myth that hints at one shared origin. That's where the next part of this journey leads, into the patterns hidden within words and shapes, the visual memory of the first civilization that spoke not only through sound, but through symbols that have never stopped speaking. Before there were words, there were shapes. Long before humans could write, before language solidified into grammar or script, we drew. The first expressions of memory weren't sentences carved in stone, they were symbols, a handprint on a cave wall, a spiral scratched into rock, a pattern of dots and lines, repeated across thousands of miles. The earliest record of human thought is not sound, but form. When you look at those ancient marks, you're seeing the beginning of a language that predates all others. A language not of words, but of meanings too large for speech. This visual language never vanished. It evolved quietly, weaving itself into myth, art, and architecture. It became the grammar of sacred design, the hidden structure behind every temple, every carving, every ritual object. The same patterns, circles, triangles, serpents, suns, trees appear in cultures that never met, painted, carved, or woven into daily life. It's as though humanity has been speaking a silent language across continents, one that doesn't depend on translation because it belongs to something deeper than culture. The consistency is astonishing. A spiral carved into a rock in Ireland 10,000 years ago matches one found in Peru in the desert, Matia, and again in the sandstone of Australian caves. The meaning shifts, depending on who you ask. It can represent water, life, time, energy, or the journey of the soul, but its essence remains constant motion, continuity, evolution. The spiral is an image of memory itself, always returning, never ending. The serpent is another constant. From the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, to the cobra of Egyptian iconography, to the rainbow serpent of Aboriginal myth, it winds through human culture like a line of connection. Sometimes it's a symbol of danger, sometimes of wisdom, sometimes of renewal, but its form is always the same, a line that moves, coils, and transforms. In India, it becomes Kundalini, the energy that rises through the body. In Greece, it circles itself in the A, or Aus, the serpent eating its tail, symbol of infinity. In Norse myth, Jörmungand encircles the world, holding it together. This image appears everywhere because it's more than an image. It's a reflection of something built into the way we perceive cycles, patterns, and energy. The sun, too, burns across every mythology, drawn as a circle with rays or a dot within a ring. To ancient peoples, it wasn't just light, it was life itself, the unending heart of time. The sun's daily death and rebirth became the first story of resurrection. To the Egyptians, it was Ra's journey through the underworld each night, returning with dawn. To the Inca, it was Ini, the father of kings. To the early Europeans, it was the wheel that turned the seasons. The same image, a circle divided into 4 parts, appears carved into stones, painted onto pottery, and woven into textiles across thousands of years. It's not just art, it's the first calendar, the original model of the universe. These symbols, spiral, serpent, sun, are part of what some researchers call the global symbolic set. They appear wherever humans do, from Paleolithic caves to Bronze Age temples to modern logos. The question is why? How did the same shapes emerge in isolation among people who never met? Were they coincidences or memories? It's tempting to explain them as universal archetypes, forms that arise naturally from how the human brain processes the world. That may be part of it, but their recurrence in the context of myth suggests more. These shapes might be remnants of a visual language developed by the first civilization, a system of symbols used to represent knowledge too complex for words. When that civilization vanished, the symbols remained, carried unconsciously through art and ritual. Over time, they lost their literal meaning, but retained their emotional power. Think of symbols as fossils of thought. They don't tell you everything about the organism, but they show its outline, its structure. If the first civilization had a language of geometry, a way of encoding scientific, astronomical, or philosophical knowledge into visual form, then its fragments might still be hiding in plain sight. We see them as decoration. They may have been data. Consider the use of geometry in ancient architecture. The circle, the square, and the triangle weren't just shapes. They represented principles. The circle symbolized the infinite, the unchanging. The square represented material reality, the world of form and balance. The triangle symbolized harmony, the bridge between heaven and earth. Together, they form the foundation of sacred geometry, the mathematical language of creation. These relationships appear in Egyptian pyramids, in Greek temples, in Hindu mandalas, and in Gothic cathedrals. Across all of them runs the same thread, the belief that numbers and shapes mirror the structure of the universe. It's possible that this belief wasn't merely spiritual, but practical, a memory of how the first builders harmonized their structures with natural laws. Geometry was their way of communicating balance, of tuning architecture to the rhythms of the cosmos. Each proportion carried meaning. Each alignment corresponded to celestial movement. To build in harmony with these proportions was to participate in the order of the universe. That's why certain symbols feel innately meaningful even now. The triangle pointing upward or downward, the interlocking loops of infinity, the six-pointed star, the cross dividing a circle. They resonate without needing explanation. They belong to a language older than religion, older than words, one that speaks directly to pattern recognition itself. Archaeologists sometimes find symbols carved into stone that repeat in wildly different contexts: zigzags, spirals, chevrons, grids. Many of these appear tens of thousands of years before writing. In the caves of Lascaux and Chauvet, among the paintings of animals, there are abstract signs, clusters of dots, ladder shapes, Y figures that recur across Europe and Asia. Research suggests they may have represented concepts like birth, death, migration, or season. If that's true, then symbolic language predates writing by tens of millennia. It was humanity's first shared code. If the first civilization inherited or expanded that system, its memory would still be embedded in global art. Take the motif of the world tree, a single axis connecting heaven, earth, and underworld. It appears in Norse Yggdrasil, in the Mayan cable, in the Indian Ashvatha, in the Egyptian Djed pillar. It's always a vertical line, binding realms, always a symbol of connection. It's as though people everywhere remembered the same concept, that existence is layered, but unified, that life flows between dimensions. Scholars interpret this as metaphors, see it as a remnant of ancient cosmology, a literal description of how early people understood the universe, perhaps inherited from those who mapped it. Long before the axis mundi, the world pillar might have been for third, both spiritual and scientific, a model of gravity, magnetism, or energy flow, described in the only form that could survive forgetting. The same might be said of the circle divided into four, the cross within the wheel. It represents the solstices and equinoxes, the four corners of the year, but also the four elements: earth, air, fire, water. Every ancient cosmology uses it: the Native American medicine wheel, the Celtic cross, the Chinese cardinal directions, the Egyptian balance of Mayat, all variations of the same image. This isn't mere coincidence, it's consistency. The symbol encodes a universal truth, the world as a system of balance and cycles. Even writing systems themselves might have evolved from this symbolic foundation. The earlier scripts can form hieroglyphs proto-Semitic. The Indus signs are hybrids of image and abstraction. They didn't emerge suddenly from nothing. They seem to have grown out of a pre-existing visual vocabulary. That vocabulary might trace all the way back to the symbolic system of the first civilization, passed down through memory until it became letters and numbers. Numbers, in fact, might be the purest form of this lost language. They carry meaning without translation. 1 is unity, 2 is duality, 3 is balance, 4 is structure. These associations are ancient, appearing in myth and architecture alike. The Pythagoreans believed numbers were the essence of reality, and their philosophy was not invention but rediscovery. They learned from Egypt and Babylon, whose priests in turn claimed their knowledge came from even earlier times. The chain of memory leads always backward toward a first understanding that has never quite been forgotten. That's what makes symbols so powerful. They bypass the rational mind and speak directly to something older, the instinctive part of us that recognizes pattern as truth. You don't need to be taught that a spiral means movement or that a circle means wholeness. You feel it. The same recognition connects us to the people who carved those forms into stone tens of thousands of years ago. When you trace a spiral with your finger, you're participating in the same gesture that someone made before history began. It's possible that this continuity isn't just coincidence, but inheritance. The symbolic language of the ancients may have encoded practical knowledge, astronomy, geometry, even physics in forms that emotion and intuition could preserve. A farmer who didn't know trigonometry could still plant by the symbol of the sun and the serpent. A builder who couldn't read could still align his work by the sacred circle. The system worked because it was intuitive, not because it was explained. That's why it survived. Over time, as language evolved and writing took over, these symbols became ornamental, then mystical. Secret societies, alchemists, and esoteric traditions tried to decode them, each adding their own layers of meaning. But perhaps they were all chasing something simpler, the original grammar of understanding that connected humans to the world. The alchemist diagrams, the mandalas of the East, the stained glass geometry of cathedrals, all are attempts to speak the same silent language. Even in modern science, the echo persists. The shapes of galaxies, the orbits of electrons, the double helix of DNA, they all mirror the same patterns that ancient people carved into rock. The spiral, the circle, the wave. It's as though nature itself speaks this symbolic language, and humans at some deep level still remember how to read it. When we find these symbols in ancient ruins, we often label them art. But art is just the visible part of something deeper. Those patterns weren't decoration, they were communication. If we could decode them fully, we might find that they tell the same story as the myths. The story of creation, destruction, and rebirth, of the balance between earth and sky, of knowledge lost and found. The symbols are the visual chorus of that story, repeating its rhythm across time. The more we study them, the more connected they seem. A spiral in Ireland mirrors one in India. A serpent in Mesoamerica mirrors one in Egypt. A wheel in Tibet mirrors one in Scandinavia. The same shapes, the same meanings across 10,000 years. Either humanity is unimaginably consistent, or we are remembering something together. And maybe that's the point. The language of symbols doesn't belong to anyone's civilization. It belongs to memory itself. It's how knowledge hides when words are lost. It's how understanding travels when people forget. The next time you see an ancient carving, a spiral, a sun, a serpent, imagine it speaking, not in words, but in recognition. It's telling you that someone long before history saw the same patterns you do. They understood something fundamental about the world, something that couldn't be erased, even by catastrophe. Those carvings, those symbols, are the voices of the first civilization still whispering through time, and as we follow them, they begin to form a bridge between myth and measurement, between belief and science. They lead us to the moment when those two worlds began to meet again, when human curiosity started to reawaken and look at the old stories not just as legend, but as evidence. That's where the trail goes next, to the meeting point between imagination and investigation, where science begins to listen to myth and finds to its quiet surprise that some of the old memories might be telling the truth. There comes a point in every story where curiosity turns into investigation, where wonder becomes a question. For most of history, science and myth have been cast as opposites, one reaching for proof, the other holding on to meaning. But if you look closely, they aren't so different. Both begin in the same place, with not knowing. Both are attempts to describe the world, to understand what came before, what lies beneath, what connects everything. The difference is that myth tells its truth through story, while science tells them through pattern. One remembers through emotion, the other through measurement. And sometimes, after a long enough time, the two begin to overlap again. It's easy to forget that science itself was born out of mythic curiosity. The first astronomers were priests. The first physicians were healers who invoked gods of medicine. The first chemists were alchemists, searching for transformation. The boundaries we draw now didn't exist then. Knowledge was whole. The same people who built temples also charted stars. The same rituals that honored gods often contained practical wisdom about farming, weather, or health. Myth was not ignorance. It was the first framework for understanding. When modern scientists began studying the natural world with new tools, they started to find traces of truth hidden inside old stories. The flood myths, once dismissed as allegory, began to align with geological evidence of sudden sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. Ancient calendars, once seen as primitive superstition, turned out to be more accurate than medieval ones. The pyramids and temples, once thought to be purely religious, revealed alignments so precise that they functioned as observatories. Step by step, what had been myth became data. Take for example the story of the Great Flood. For thousands of years, it was seen as a moral tale, a parable about pride and renewal. Then, scientists discovered the massive floods that followed the melting of the Ice Age glaciers, events that reshaped coastlines, drowned valleys, and raised sea levels worldwide. The flood that wouldn't die turned out to have a physical basis. The memory of rising water wasn't fantasy. It was eyewitness history carried through myth. Or consider the ancient fascination with the stars. The Egyptians aligned their pyramids with Orion's belt and Sirius. The Mayans tracked Venus with mathematical precision, and Stonehenge marked solstices with perfect accuracy. For centuries, these alignments were dismissed as coincidence or primitive astrology. Now, astronomers recognize that these were genuine observatories, instruments designed to measure time and track celestial cycles. The ancients were not dreamers gazing at the heavens. They were scientists using the sky as their laboratory. The line between myth and science blurs further when you examine medicine. In early societies, healing was surrounded by ritual, prayer, and symbolism. Herbs were blessed before being used. Incantations were recited over the sick. To modern minds, that seems like superstition. Yet, many of those herbs contained real pharmacological properties. Willow bark used in ancient Greece for pain led to the discovery of aspirin. Moldy bread used in Egypt for wounds anticipated antibiotics. The ritual may have been symbolic, but the practice was empirical. It worked. The myth kept the memory of what worked alive long before anyone knew why it worked. This is how knowledge survives, even when reason forgets. Myths hold the shape of truth long after the details fade. Their memory in disguise, carrying information through emotional resonance instead of technical explanation. When science finally catches up, it often finds that myth was describing the same reality all along, just in a different dialect. One of the most striking examples of this is the myth of the world tree, the axis connecting heaven and earth. In nearly every culture from Norse to Mayan to Hindu, there's a vision of the universe as a layered structure held together by a central spine. It sounds poetic, but in a way, it's also physical. Modern science describes the universe as a web of connections where everything influences everything else through invisible networks of gravity, energy, and space-time. The axis isn't literal, but the concept, a structure linking all realms, is remarkably accurate. The mythic image captured the pattern of the cosmos long before physics found the equations. Even creation myths hold hidden parallels. The ancient Egyptian story of Atom emerging from the waters of chaos to bring forth light mirrors the Big Bang emerging from the void. The Hindu story of Brahma breathing out the universe and drawing it back in mirrors modern cosmology cycles of expansion and contraction. The North story of Ymir, the primordial giant whose body becomes the world, parallels the idea of matter forming from a singular source. These similarities don't mean ancient people knew physics, they mean they felt the same need to explain origins, and their metaphors captured the rhythm of this reality. What's most intriguing is how the scientific discoveries of the last century have begun to sound more like myth than mechanism. Quantum physics speaks of particles that exist everywhere and nowhere until observed, of entanglement that connects objects across vast distances as if by invisible threads. Space-time curves like a woven fabric. Matter vibrates as energy. These are not the cold certainties of old science. They're stories of mystery, of interconnection, of unseen forces. The same kinds of truths myth has been whispering for millennia. In that sense, myth and science are not rivals, but companions. Myth kept the questions alive until science could ask them again. Science gives myth its structure back, restoring what was lost to forgetting. Together, they form a continuity, the human drive to know, preserved through every language we've ever spoken. The rediscovery of ancient knowledge through modern tools often feels less like progress and more like remembering. Archaeologists unearth megalithic sites that seem to predate civilization as we define it. Geologists find evidence of rapid climate shifts, matching ancient catastrophes. Geneticists trace human migrations that align with old myths of origin and exile. Each new discovery doesn't replace myth, it confirms it in another register. Take the Aboriginal stories of the dream time. For generations, they were considered mythic, symbolic accounts of creation. Then researchers began comparing them to geological and archaeological data. They found that some dream stories accurately describe volcanic eruptions and changing coastlines from over 7,000 years ago. Oral memory, encoded in story, had preserved real events longer than any written record. Myth, it turns out, can be more durable than writing. In the same way, Polynesian navigation legends, once dismissed as fable, have proven to contain precise astronomical knowledge. The charts used by wayfinders encode star paths, currents, and distances. They are oral maps, accurate across thousands of miles of open ocean. The line between myth and manual dissolves completely when you realize those songs weren't metaphors. They were data storage, encoded in rhythm. Science has also begun to revisit the notion of ancient global connections. For decades, mainstream history assumed that early civilizations developed in isolation, but as evidence accumulates, shared symbols, matching architecture, genetic markers, that assumption weakens. It's not that ships crossed oceans constantly, but that knowledge like seeds can travel in ways we don't always see. The similarities between pyramid structures in Egypt, Mesoamerica, and Asia may not be coincidence. They could be the echo of a shared ancestral model preserved through the ages like a genetic memory of architecture. Some scientists are cautious about these connections, as they should be. Skepticism is part of the method, but curiosity persists. The question, what if, keeps returning. What if the myths are right, at least in part? What if they are our oldest observations, carried forward through language and story, until instruments could measure what memory had already preserved? When astronomers discovered that the Earth's axis slowly wobbles over millennia, a movement called precession. They were astonished to find traces of this knowledge in ancient architecture and myth. The Egyptians, Mayans, and Hindus all reference cycles of thousands of years corresponding to this astronomical shift. How could they have known? Observing precession requires continuous records spanning generations. It suggests not just curiosity, but institutions of observation older than any surviving culture. If science confirms that they did know, then myth was not exaggeration. It was recollection. And perhaps that's the key to understanding the relationship between myth and science. Myth preserves the emotional truth, while science reconstructs the mechanical one. Together, they tell the whole story. The myth remembers what it felt like to watch the sky change. The science measures how it happens. The two are not at war. They are two hemispheres of the same mind. When scientists today map cosmic background radiation or decode DNA, they're performing acts of observation as sacred in their own way. As the ancient priest watching the sunrise between temple stones, both are seeking the same thing: to see order in chaos, to find meaning in pattern. The difference is not in purpose, but in method. Myth paints with story, science draws with numbers, but both are trying to remember where we came from. That's why the re-emergence of ancient knowledge through modern science feels familiar. It's not just discovery, it's déjà vu. We sense we've heard this story before. The idea that everything is connected, that life and matter are one, that energy flows in cycles. These are not new revelations, they are ancient truths, dressed in new language. If the first civilization had reached an understanding of the natural world that integrated both mythic and empirical thinking, its memory would look exactly like what we have today. A world slowly rediscovering coherence piece by piece. We call it progress, but it might just be the long path of remembering. Even the scientific method itself, observation, hypothesis, experiment, conclusion, mirrors the mythic pattern of creation, exploration, and return. The hero's journey and the scientific process follow the same structure. Encounter the unknown, transform through understanding, bring back knowledge to share. The forms differ, but the rhythm is the same. The structure of human curiosity hasn't changed in 50,000 years. What makes this connection so profound is that both science and myth are ways of seeing, not just ways of knowing. They shape perception. The ancients saw the world as alive, conscious, connected. Science, after centuries of separating subject and object, is beginning to return to that view through ecology, systems theory, quantum physics. The old myths are beginning to sound less symbolic and more descriptive. When myth says the world is alive, and physics says everything is energy, they may be pointing to the same truth from opposite directions. If we think of myth as the dream of humanity, and science as its waking mind, then we are living in a moment where the two are beginning to speak again. The dreams are remembering their details. The waking mind is starting to listen. This is where the forgotten civilization might be found, not in ruins beneath the sea, but in the overlap between imagination and observation. In the moment when a story becomes an equation, and the equation proves the story right, that's the quiet miracle of rediscovery. When we find that the ancients were not wrong, just speaking differently. When the myths of the past align with the instruments of the present, and the boundary between belief and knowledge fades into something older than both. And as we reach that point, something remarkable happens. We begin to see the myths, not as fantasies, but as early models of reality. We stop dividing truth into scientific and spiritual. We begin to remember that the two were once the same thing. Somewhere in the stories that have lasted the longest lies a record of that unity, a memory of the time when the gods and the map-makers and the builders all spoke the same language of understanding. Science is the modern translation of that memory, slowly piecing together what the ancients encoded in stone and story. It's not that myth needs to become science, or science to become myth. It's that the two, when combined, reveal a fuller picture of what it means to be human. a creature capable of wonder and reason, dream and discovery, memory and measurement. And as that picture sharpens, the next question begins to form. What if one of those myths, the one that never quite goes away, the one that keeps returning in every age, holds the clearest reflection of that first civilization? What if the story of a lost world beneath the sea is more than allegory? Because in every tradition, no matter the continent or culture, there's always that one enduring memory of a place that fell, a people who vanished. A golden age swallowed by water, but never by time. A story that has survived every language, every empire, every forgetting. That's where the path leads, next to the most persistent memory of them all. The dream of a lost world that refuses to die. The civilization whose name became a symbol for the entire idea of what was lost. The one we still call Atlantis. Every civilization has its dream of a lost world, a place of balance and beauty that existed before the great forgetting, before the flood, before the long climb back toward memory. For most of the world, that dream has one name: Atlantis. The word itself has become shorthand for something we can't quite prove, but can't stop imagining. The first civilization, erased by catastrophe, but remembered in fragments, as if the earth itself keeps whispering its name through stone and sea. The story of Atlantis doesn't begin in the deep past. It begins with Plato around 360 B.C. He wrote about it in his dialogues to Critias. According to his account, Atlantis was an island empire beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. It was said to have been larger than Libya and Asia combined. Rich in metals, fertile in soil, and advanced in knowledge, its people were powerful and proud, their civilization guided by divine ancestors. But in time, their arrogance grew. They turned away from wisdom, and the gods, displeased, sent earthquakes and floods that swallowed the island in a single day and night of misfortune. Plato claimed he wasn't inventing this story. He said it came from the priests of Egypt who had told it to Solon, the famous Athenian lawmaker who passed it on to his descendants. According to them, Atlantis had fallen 9,000 years before Plato's time, far older than any recorded civilization. To him, it was both a moral parable and a historical account. He used it to illustrate the rise and fall of human virtue, the cycle of creation and corruption. But to later generations, it became something else, a riddle. For more than 2,000 years, the story has refused to stay quiet. Every era has reimagined it, moved it, renamed it. Scholars, explorers, mystics, and dreamers have all searched for it. In the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, Antarctica, some place it beneath the waves near Spain, others beneath the sands of the Sahara. Some see it as an island, others as a continent. But no matter how it's reinterpreted, the essence of the story remains constant. A lost civilization, destroyed by water, remembered through myth. What makes Atlantis different from other myths is how specific Plato was. He gave details, the dimensions of the island, the layout of its capital, the structure of its society, the geography of its mountains and plains. He described canals for irrigation, harbors, temples, and metals unknown to the Greeks, including a mysterious red alloy called orichalcum, said to gleam like fire. He spoke of kings descended from gods, of laws inscribed on pillars, of a people who combined human and divine nature. It wasn't a vague paradise, it was a civilization, and that precision is what keeps the story alive. For centuries, historians debated whether Plato invented it. Some saw it as pure allegory, a symbolic tale of hubris. Others pointed out that his timelines, when taken literally, placed Atlantis around the end of the Ice Age, the very period when global floods reshaped the world. To many, that coincidence feels too close to ignore. What if Plato wasn't describing a moral fable, but a memory, one passed down through Egyptian priests who themselves inherited fragments of an older oral tradition? If so, Atlantis might not be a single island, but the last echo of a real culture remembered through the language of myth. There are clues scattered across the world that keep the question open. Off the coast of Spain, near Cadiz, underwater formations match Plato's descriptions of concentric rings. In the Caribbean, sonar scans have revealed anomalous structures deep below the surface. In the Sahara, the rich structure, a massive circular formation in Mauritania, bears a striking resemblance to Plato's sewn map of Atlantis, with mountains to the north and traces of ancient waterways nearby. None of these are definitive, but together they suggest a pattern. Something large, organized, and very old once existed, where today there is silence. Atlantis isn't the only memory of a lost world. The same idea appears everywhere under different names. The Greeks had Hyperborea, a northern paradise of long light and perfect balance. The Hindus described Shambhala, a hidden kingdom of wisdom beyond the mountains. The Celts told of Avalon, the isle of eternal youth. The Egyptians spoke of Zepte, the first time when gods and men lived together before a great flood. In the Pacific, Polynesian myths tell of Hawaii, the ancestral homeland swallowed by the sea. These are not separate stories. They are the same memory told through different landscapes. The pattern repeats too neatly to dismiss. Every culture recalls a golden age, an advanced society that fell due to disaster, pride, or cosmic change. Every culture remembers a time when knowledge and nature were in harmony and then lost. It's as though humanity can't shake the feeling that we're reliving in the shadow of something older, not less advanced, but differently advanced. A civilization that mastered stability rather than speed, understanding rather than power. Modern archaeology is cautious about Atlantis, and rightly so. Evidence must come before theory, but even without a single confirmed ruin, the persistence of the story demands explanation. Myths that endure this long do so for a reason. They preserve emotional truth that history hasn't yet measured. Atlantis may not be a place we can map, but it could be the cultural memory of an era that really ended. The final flowering of a pre-Ice Age civilization erased by rising seas. Around the time Plato claimed Atlantis fell, the world was indeed transforming. Glaciers melted, coastlines shifted, and entire ecosystems collapsed. Vast areas that had been dry land, like the Sun Shelf in Southeast Asia, or dogland between Britain and Europe, vanished beneath the ocean. People living in those regions would have experienced their worlds drowning, villages and fields swallowed by waves. To them, it would have been apocalyptic. If one of those regions had developed a complex society, its destruction would have inspired legends that lasted forever. What's more intriguing is that some of the world's oldest monuments appear right after this period, as if survivors were rebuilding. Göbekli in Turkey, often dated to around 11,000 years ago, appears suddenly and fully formed, with no obvious precedent. Its builders knew how to quarry, carve, and align massive stones, skills that seem to arrive from nowhere. That timing coincides with the supposed end of Atlantis. Maybe that's coincidence, or maybe it's continuity. Fragments of a civilization resurfacing in new forms after the flood. The myth of Atlantis could be memory filtered through time, distorted but not erased. The Egyptians' own records speak of multiple cycles of destruction and rebirth. They didn't see history as linear but circular. Civilizations rose, fell, and rose again, each time remembering a little less of the last. To them, Zepi wasn't just a mythic beginning. It was a recurring state, the restoration of balance after chaos. Atlantis might be one of those cycles, the most recent echo of the first age before forgetting. If that's true, then the story of Atlantis isn't about loss alone. It's about recurrence. A reminder that knowledge rises and falls like tides, that civilizations are not beginnings, but continuations. The Atlanteans, whether real or remembered, might represent the phase of human history when balance was achieved, when understanding aligned with the natural world. Their fall would then be a warning embedded in our collective memory, not just that civilizations can be destroyed, but that wisdom can turn to arrogance if we forget where it came from. Plato himself said that Atlantis fell because its people became greedy and corrupt, losing touch with the divine order that had once guided them. It's a theme that feels timeless. In mythic language, the divine often means alignment, harmony, with natural law. To fall from grace is to lose that harmony. Perhaps that's what really happened to the civilization before us. They didn't just vanish, they fell out of sync, their knowledge survived, scattered through myth, but their understanding of balance was lost. Even now, fragments of that memory still surface in ancient maps, in unexplained ruins, in inexplicable skills. Some oceanographers have found submerged terraces and structures that appear artificial, though erosion makes them hard to confirm. Divers off the coast of Japan discovered Yonauni, a massive underwater formation of right angles and steps resembling a city. Off India's coast, near Dwarka, sonar revealed walls and streets now buried beneath silt. These may not be Atlantis, but they show that the sea hides more of our story than we realize. The fascination with Atlantis isn't just about geography, it's about longing. It's the instinctive pull toward a time when humanity and the world were in balance. That's why the myth endures, even without proof. It speaks to something we feel missing, not technology, but coherence. We imagine Atlantis as advanced because we assume progress is material, but perhaps its advancement was spiritual, ecological, social. Maybe its real achievement was equilibrium, a civilization that understood enough to live without destroying its foundation. In that sense, Atlantis is less a lost city and more a lost idea. The memory of balance. When we dream of it, we're not yearning for machines or temples. We're yearning for the state of mind that built them, the calm clarity of people who knew their place within a living world. Science, in its way, is beginning to rediscover that idea. Ecology, systems theory, and planetary science all describe the Earth as an interconnected organism. What ancient myth called the divine order, we now call equilibrium. What Plato called hubris, we might call unsustainable growth. The fall of Atlantis, then, is not just a story of the past, but a pattern, one that repeats whenever knowledge outruns wisdom. Every few centuries, humanity retells the Atlantis story in new form. In the Renaissance, it became a vision of utopia, an ideal society guided by reason. In the Enlightenment, it symbolized scientific progress. In the modern age, it's become both caution and hope, the dream of lost harmony and the warning of what happens when we lose it again. The myth adjusts to every era because it reflects the same cycle: discovery, mastery, imbalance, collapse, renewal. What makes Atlantis so persistent is not the possibility that it existed, but the certainty that its story will always be relevant. It's our collective reflection, the shadow of memory cast by every civilization that rises. When we look for it, we're really looking for ourselves. There's an unspoken recognition in that search. We feel that the line between myth and memory is thin, that the dream of Atlantis is not fantasy, but nostalgia for a time when the world made sense. It's a memory so old, it no longer belongs to history, only to humanity itself. The story continues because it still has work to do. It reminds us that forgetting is always temporary, that even when knowledge sinks beneath the waves, it waits for us to find it again. And perhaps that's why Atlantis has never been found. Not because it doesn't exist, but because it isn't one place. It's every place where memory and nature once aligned, every city built on forgotten wisdom, every moment when humans remembered that they too are part of the pattern. The lost world isn't out there. It's underfoot, hidden in plain sight, in the geometry of our cities, in the cycles of our science, in the myths that still echo through our stories. The dream of Atlantis endures because it isn't over. It's the unfinished sentence of civilization, the one we've been trying to complete for 12,000 years. It's the reminder that history is not progress, but memory unfolding. And when we dream of that lost world, we're not imagining the past. We're hearing the future remembering itself. Somewhere beyond the pillars of memory, beneath the waves of forgetting, that idea still waits, not as ruin, but as potential. The world that was, and the world that could be separated, only by how well we remember what balance feels like. And as the dream fades into the quiet hum of the present, it leads naturally toward one last reflection, not of loss, but of continuity. Because if Atlantis was the first civilization, then we are its latest echo, still writing the same story. The story that began before time, that continues through every myth, every discovery, every attempt to understand who we are and where we came from. That's where the journey now turns, toward that endless story itself, the one that has never stopped unfolding, carried forward through every age, still whispering to us, in the language of memory and wonder. Stories never really end, they only change the voice that tells them. Each generation picks up the thread where the last one left it, weaving old memory into new meaning. What we call history is just the visible part of that weaving. Beneath it lies a quieter layer, the story that never stopped, the one that began long before the first written word, before the first monument, before the first forgetting. It's the story of how humanity remembers itself. If you look closely, you can feel that continuity everywhere. The myths of creation, the ruins of stone, the symbols carved into cave walls. They aren't separate chapters, but verses of the same long song. The melody changes, but the rhythm never stops. It moves through language, through architecture, through ritual, through science, through the way we look at the stars and ask the same questions again and again. The first civilization may have fallen, but its story didn't. It just changed form. Even now, in a world of satellites and digital maps, that old instinct remains. We still build monuments to understanding, not from stone, but from data and mathematics. We still trace the heavens, still measure time by the movement of celestial bodies, still look for patterns that remind us we belong to something larger. The impulse that once shaped pyramids now shapes particle accelerators and telescopes. The materials have changed, but the purpose hasn't. We're still trying to see the structure of reality, to find order in the infinite. What's striking is how familiar our discoveries sound when compared to ancient thought. Modern cosmology describes the universe as a single unfolding event, a vast continuum of matter and energy that began as one and continues to expand. That's not far from the old myths that described the world as breath or sound or vibration, one act of creation still resonating. Quantum physics describes all things as connected, entangled across time and space, not separate, but part of one field. That too is what myth said, that everything is alive, that separation is illusion, that what we do to one part of the world affects the rest. It's as if the story is remembering itself, piece by piece through us. Science is rediscovering what myth never forgot, that understanding and belonging are the same thing. To know the world isn't to stand outside it, but to realize you were never apart from it. The ancients built that realization into their monuments, aligning them with the stars to show that the earth was part of the same pattern. We're doing the same thing now, just with different tools. The telescopes that map galaxies are modern pyramids, instruments of alignment that connect us once again to the cosmos. The idea of the first civilization isn't just about a lost society, it's about continuity. The realization that knowledge never truly disappears. It only changes form. When a culture falls, its wisdom doesn't vanish. It moves underground into story, into symbol, into intuition. That's how memory survives catastrophe. That's why every myth, no matter how strange, carries something familiar. We recognize ourselves in it. We hear the echo of our own thoughts and voices, thousands of years old. Every discovery humanity makes seems to come with that echo. When we find that ancient peoples track the stars with precision, rivaling our own, we feel awe, but also recognition. When we unearth structures built with impossible accuracy, we feel wonder, but also something like déjà vu. It's as if the memory of how to do these things never completely left us. It just waited beneath the surface until curiosity called it back. That's what makes the idea of cycles so compelling. The first civilization might not have been the first at all, just the latest of many. The Earth has erased its surface more times than we can count. Continents shift, climates change, oceans rise and fall. Each time life begins again, and memory rebuilds itself. We may not be living in the aftermath of the first forgetting, but one of many. Perhaps this rhythm, creation, loss, rediscovery, or is not a flaw in history, but its heartbeat. If you think of human knowledge as a single consciousness stretched across millennia, then the great ages of discovery are its moments of awakening. The fall of civilizations are its dreams. The myths are its murmured thoughts while sleeping. When we study those myths, we're not just learning about the past, we're listening to ourselves in another form. The mind that built the first temples is the same mind that builds our machines. It just keeps changing shape. That continuity explains why we're drawn to stories of beginnings. Every culture has its own version of the first time. Zepi, Eden, the dream time, the golden age. We keep returning to that idea because we sense that remembering it might help us understand where we're going. The story of the first civilization is not nostalgia for a lost world. It's a map of what we could be when we remember balance in our own way. We're still part of that map. The technologies we build today, global communication, shared archives of knowledge, networks that link billions of minds, are recreating something humanity once had long ago: connection. The myth of the gods descending from the sky may have been memory of explorers or teachers, but it's also a metaphor for information flowing freely between worlds. We're now doing what those myths described, sending our own voices into the heavens, shaping constellations of satellites that mirror the patterns we once traced in stars. It's not fantasy, it's repetition. History doesn't repeat events, it repeats intentions. Even the smallest things we do carry the shape of the old story. The way we plant, the way we measure time, the way we celebrate the turning of seasons. These are remnants of the first language. We don't think of them as sacred anymore, but they began that way. Every calendar, every ritual, every song that marks time is an echo of the original alignment between earth and sky. We're still marking the rhythm of the universe, even if we've forgotten why it feels right to do so. What's interesting is that this memory doesn't only survive in tradition, it lives in instinct. There are patterns that humanity keeps rediscovering without knowing they're old. The Fibonacci sequence in nature, the golden ratio in design, the concept of resonance in physics and art. These appear again and again, not because we copy the ancients, but because both we and they are responding to the same underlying order. The story we're telling isn't separate from nature's story. We're part of it, writing it as we live it. That's why the myth of the first civilization is so enduring. It isn't just a question of archaeology or lost technology. It's the deeper recognition that humanity's story has never been about invention, but remembrance. We are remembering how to live in tune with the same forces that shaped the beginning. When we look back at the myths and see reflections of modern science, it's not coincidence, it's continuity, different expressions of the same truth, spoken in the languages of different ages. The first civilization, whatever it was called, might not have vanished in the way we imagine. Its stones may be gone, but its memory was passed into everything that followed. The geometry of its temples became the geometry of cathedrals. The balance of its architecture became the laws of physics. The idea that knowledge must serve harmony became the moral of every myth. That's what survives catastrophe. Not the form, but the principle. There's something comforting about that. It means that forgetting isn't failure, just part of the process. The story forgets details so it can remember patterns. It loses precision so it can survive in spirit. That's how myths work. They trade accuracy for endurance. Facts fade, but meaning endures. The first civilization may have been erased physically, but the pattern of its understanding has never left us. It reappears in every attempt to bring order to chaos, in every culture that builds something aligned with the stars, in every person who feels awe at the night sky. We often think of progress as leaving the past behind, but maybe progress is the opposite. The gradual rediscovery of everything we used to know, translated into new forms. When we send probes to other planets, when we map the origins of the universe, we're reenacting the same curiosity that led the ancients to build observatories of stone. When we study genetics and trace life back to a single ancestor, we're doing what they did in story, telling ourselves that all things come from one source. The methods change, but the desire is ancient. If the story has any direction at all, it might be toward integration. The first civilization, the myths, the sciences, the technologies, they're all parts of the same continuum, trying to remember its wholeness. The more we learn, the closer we come to seeing that knowledge and wisdom are not separate. One measures, the other understands. The balance between them might be what the ancients called divine order. When that balance is lost, the cycle resets. When it's restored, civilization rises again. That pattern suggests that history itself might be self-correcting. Each age that forgets eventually rediscovers. Each collapse creates space for renewal. The first civilization fell, but it left behind the blueprint of recovery. Remember the connection, rebuild with balance, live in awareness of time cycles. We're following that blueprint still, even if we don't realize it. There's something almost biological about it. Memory and nature doesn't die. It rewrites itself. The earth forgets through erosion, but the fossils remain. The genome forgets through mutation, but the structure persists. Human culture forgets through catastrophe, but the myths remain. The story is alive because forgetting and remembering are part of its metabolism. Without one, the other wouldn't exist. When you step back and look at it that way, the idea of a first civilization becomes less about a lost city and more about a continuous consciousness, a field of awareness that moves through time, building, falling, rebuilding. We're one moment in that cycle, just as they were. The real difference between us and them might be smaller than we think. They looked at the stars and saw gods. We look and see galaxies, but the feeling is the same. The quiet wonder that says we are part of this. We always have been. That's the thread that connects everything. The myth of the gods, the science of the stars, the geometry of the builders, the curiosity of the modern mind. All variations of one impulse, to remember the order of things, to rediscover that we belong not outside the world but within it. And so the story continues, as it always has. Each age retells it in its own way, layering new understanding over old memory. We're both the audience and the authors. We inherit the myths and add our own versions, our own discoveries, our own dreams. The story grows longer, but its essence never changes. It's the same rhythm that began in the first breath of creation. The pulse of knowing and forgetting, of seeking and finding, of asking and remembering. You can feel it even now, in the quiet moments when the world slows down and you look up at the night sky. The stars don't change much in a human lifetime, but they remind us how old our questions are. They are the same lights the first storytellers watched, the same ones the builders aligned their stones to, the same ones that guided navigators across oceans of water and now of space. Now of the story doesn't live in the stars themselves, but in our relationship to them. Every time we look up, we're adding another line to that endless memory. Maybe that's the real meaning of the first civilization. Not that it was lost, but that it's never stopped living through us, through our curiosity, through the way we keep asking what came before. The continuity is not physical, it's mental, emotional, cosmic. The memory is written into our instincts, into the way we build, think, and wonder. And when you listen to that story long enough, it begins to sound less like history and more like a heartbeat, steady, patient, eternal, a pulse that runs through everything from the first spark of fire to the quiet hum of the present. The same energy that built the first temples is building our future. Still, one thought, one question, one rediscovery at a time. The endless story isn't about beginnings or endings. It's about the space between, the continuity that keeps everything alive. The myths, the science, the symbols, the memories, the people who remember, and the people who forget, all are part of the same long breath. The first civilization didn't vanish, it exhaled. We are the next inhale. Somewhere in the rhythm of that breathing, the story keeps writing itself. It moves through us whether we know it or not. We are the latest chapter in an unfinished book. Still listening, still learning, still remembering. And as long as someone somewhere wonders where we came from, the story will go on. Endless, quiet, and alive.